The agenda is, for us to, to begin, now, 10 o'clock, and we'll stop for a lunch break, approximately 12 to 1, and then at 1 o'clock we will continue, and hopefully we can adjourn at 3 o'clock. And we've also allowed, some time for Dr. Doug Hamilton to provide a presentation, and we'll also be discussing the IPRP and PG&E's comments, on Dr. Hamilton's concerns. With that, maybe very briefly, we can just kind of go around the room and see a few new faces. And I'd like to introduce, I'm Eric Green with the Energy Division of the California Public Utilities Commission.
Douglas Hamilton, a consulting geologist.
Michelle Becker, Alliance for Nuclear Responsibility.
Bill Page, geologist with PG&E.
Chris Mendigo, geologist with PG&E.
Ken Ferre, PG&E Geosciences Manager.
Bruce Gibson, I'm County Supervisor, San Luis Obispo County, and member of the IPRP.
Leslie Ewing, engineer of the California Coastal Commission and substitute member for the IPRP for Mark Johnson.
Chris Wilson, California Geological Survey, member of the IPRP.
Tim Dawson, California Geological Survey staff.
Robert Gibler, geologist, Lettuce Consultants.
Jeff Unruh, geologist with Lettuce Consultants.
Dan O'Connell, geophysicist, Fugro.
Stu Nishenko, technical manager for the project PG&E.
Jamie Turner, geologist for Fugro.
Josh Goodman, geologist with Fugro. I'm Steve Thompson, I'm a geologist with Lettuce Consultants.
Dan Hurst, UC Santa Cruz.
Dave Freeman, senior advisor to Friends of the Earth.
John Giesman, I'm an attorney for the Alliance for Nuclear Responsibility.
Do you want to just briefly give your name?
Gordon Seitz with California Geological Survey.
Janet Sellers, Fugro Consultants.
We're also expecting a few other members from the IPRP, from the Energy Commission, and the Seismic Safety Commission. There's a little delayed in traffic, but they should be joining us shortly. Is there anyone on the phone who would like to identify themselves? With that, maybe I'll turn the meeting over, Stu Nishenko, if you want to say some introductory words.
Okay, we'll jump right in and start the meeting.
Sure.
Okay, great. Good morning, everybody. And as Eric has indicated, this is the second, now third, 3 meetings that we have established to review the results of the Central Coastal California Seismic Imaging Report. The first one was last month, October 23rd, to look at the results of the marine investigations that we conducted. Today's meeting is to review tectonic models of the Irish Hills, basically look at some of the on-land seismic results that we've developed. And then there will be a third meeting probably in the new year to talk about site effects and site conditions at the power plant itself. So with that, let's just see if I can get this to work. Okay, so Eric went through the agenda, and just quickly to cap what is in store for us today, I'll be giving an introduction, followed by a presentation by Steve Thompson to talk about how the results of AB 1632, or the seismic imaging project, are going to be incorporated into the SHAC study. This is the Senior Seismic Hazard and Advisory Committee that PG&E is also doing in parallel with the study per requirements from the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. Following that presentation at 11 o'clock, Dan O'Connell will talk about the onshore seismic data results in kind of a 30,000-foot view in terms of what we've done to data processing, data interpretation, followed by a lunch break. And then at 1 o'clock, Jeff Unruh will talk more about interpretation of the onshore seismic data. At 2 o'clock, Steve Thompson will present our response to the testimony that Dr. Hamilton gave to the PUC about 2 years ago, which is included in the report. And then at 2:30, we reserve time for Dr. Hamilton to make a presentation. based on his thoughts and comments. With the goal of having a 3 o'clock adjournment, I guess there's an additional element now to also talk about when this third and final meeting is going to be scheduled in January. So that is our agenda for today. It's going to be pretty busy. And what I'd like to do while we make these presentations is ask folks to hold their questions to the end of the presentation so people can get through what they have to say, and then we can circle back and address specific comments or questions that you might have. As I said before, this is the second of 3 meetings to discuss the Central Coast of California Seismic Imaging Report. That report itself is posted on PG&E website. The URL is listed at the bottom of the page. So that contains all the chapters in the report. And in addition, there are instructions at the bottom here for those who are interested to access a lot of the actual geophysical data itself. So the marine data has been posted on the USGS National Archive of Marine Seismic Surveys, and the land data, which is the primary topic for today's conversation, is posted on the IRIS website. And I'll have more information about IRIS at the end of my presentation in a little while. Just to start this off, we're here primarily because of a recommendation that was made by the California Energy Commission in their 2008 report called An Assessment of California's Nuclear Power Plants, AB 1632 report. And in that report, the Energy Commission recommended that both PG&E and SoCal Edison update their seismic hazard assessments. And more importantly, for the discussion here today, they also recommended that we use 3D geophysical seismic reflection mapping and other advanced techniques to supplement previous and ongoing research programs. Now, most of the attention in the discussions we've had over the last couple of years have really been focused on 3D seismic reflection, but the point I want to make today, and this is especially critical for the presentations that you're seeing today, is that in order to come up with unique interpretations of structure in the area, we need to use other data besides just seismic reflection data. So we've used an ensemble of other geophysical data, gravity, magnetics, as well as surface geologic mapping and wellhole data to help provide a unique interpretation for this. Each one by themselves, especially the gravity and the magnetic data, are by definition non-unique, but it's the combination of all 3 together that kind of help you identify a solution which satisfies all the data sets and helps provide a lot more confidence in the interpretations that we're going to present today. And a lot of all of what we're doing today really is a result of some dramatic improvements in geophysical data acquisition over the last 20 years since the original LTSP was written back in the late 1980s. So improvements in instrumentation, geophysical data processing, faster, bigger, better computers, the advent of GPS navigation to be able to locate ourselves with unprecedented accuracy, the use of geographic information systems, and all of these have, been developed by industry, and we're using it here today for the private sector, to provide a new generation of vision into the earth. So instead of having x-rays the way we had done that in years past, we can now perform the equivalent of CT scans. So again, the analogy with your doctor's office, getting an x-ray, which is a one-plane view through the crust of the earth, versus a CT scan, which is a 3-dimensional volume that you can look from many different angles and orientations to really make sure you understand what it is that you are looking at and evaluating. So all these is what I call have served to provide a revolution in resolution that we have. And we can see things, I think, to a lot greater detail than we could 20 or 30 years ago. Now, with regards to today's presentations, which are on land seismic data, these is somewhat distinct and different from the previous presentation we did on 3D marine data. Primarily is the depth of penetration in the land data is significantly deeper than what we did for our marine surveys. So typically, and just as a matter of kind of mapping between the marine environment and the land environment, whoops, excuse me, there we go. We talked about low and high energy seismic surveys when we were looking at marine data. And the equivalents here on land for low energy are what we call accelerated weight drops, which are basically just spring-driven pistons that provide imaging down to about 1 or 2 kilometer depth. And then for deeper, or the equivalent of high energy reflection profiling, we use what we call vibra-sized trucks. And those provide a sweep of frequencies that give us imaging capabilities down to about 6 kilometers or deeper, depending on the length of recording. So this is, excuse me. So looking at 2D and 3D seismic reflection, one of the things that you need to understand is that we're looking at what we call acoustic imaging. Seismic reflection is based on impedance contrasts in the surface of the earth between different layers of rocks. So the differences in the velocity and the density give rise to reflections which are recorded in the seismic reflection arrays. So this difference in impedance then allows us to identify and map individual reflectors. And this is the basis for a lot of the fault identification that we're going to be talking about today, looking at truncations of reflectors and mapping those truncations throughout the survey area. But in addition to being able to put together 2D and 3D volumes of seismic reflection data, we can also take advantage of the other part of the seismic signal, which doesn't get reflected from these discontinuities, but actually gets refracted or transmitted through. And this is this whole idea about refraction tomography. So on one hand, we can have information both about the distribution of individual reflectors, but tomography gives us an idea about what the gross large-scale distribution of velocity structure is within the crust. And making correlations between velocities and individual formations or individual structures helps provide this 3D imaging that's so valuable for the interpretations we're going to be making today. In addition to seismic velocity, which is a function of both the density of the rocks and elastic constants, there's also the gravity field, which is a function of the density. So using both gravity information and seismic information helps provide further constraints on our interpretations of the structure in the area, as well as our interpretations of the velocity field for further processing of the seismic data. So here we're talking about doing joint inversions of both gravity and seismic data to then get a larger scale picture of what the seismic velocity and density structure looks like under the Irish Hills. And you'll see examples of that a little later this morning in looking at what we call isovelocity surfaces and isodensity surfaces. So mapping similar velocities across the entire survey area as a way to illustrate structure in 3 dimensions, in addition to looking at classic ways of truncation of individual reflectors. Now, all this data, one size does not fit all, and it's all applicable to specific depth and length scales, which we'll go and demonstrate and talk about during the presentations. But in addition then to the geophysical data, we've also made use of surface geologic mapping, wellhole data, and also magnetic field data. So the strategy, or you will, the philosophy of this whole program was to try to provide top to bottom mapping of the crust in the Irish Hills, from surface geologic mapping to as deep as we can get using other seismic and geophysical techniques to provide a comprehensive picture of the structure in the area and how this can impact hazard. This is a tornado diagram which looks at a comparison of what we call hazard significance source characterization parameters. The parameters on the y-axis of the diagram were identified back in 2011 based on information that came out of the 2011 Shoreline Fault Zone report that PG&E issued to the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, and it's sort of an evaluation in probability space of how does uncertainty and large values, or the availability of large values for some of these parameters, really impact our ability to identify hazard and reduce uncertainty in hazard. Most of the parameters that you see here have to do with faulting that's offshore. Hosgri fault slip, shoreline slip rates, step overs between adjacent fault systems. All of this was covered in last month's meeting. And the two primary, or the primary fault that we're going to discuss today is the Los Osos. So seeing what information we can provide that bears on improving our estimates of the dip of the Los Osos, as well as its census slip or potentially slip rate. The tornado diagram itself is basically just a comparison of the variability of each one of these parameters with respect to a mean hazard that's pinned at a return time of 10 to the minus 4 and a level of ground shaking at 2G. So basically values that are greater 1, higher hazard, values that are less than 1 have less hazard. And what we managed to do with the surveys that we have conducted is for many of these parameters significantly reduce that range of values, that uncertainty. You can kind of see the blue being the 2014 values has significantly reduced the range in slip rates for the Hosgri dip, as well as slip rates for the shoreline fault zone. For the Los Osos dip, which is what we're going to be talking about today, we've also managed to constrain where we could that dip value. So we're looking at geometry. But it's also important to remember that in 2008, when the Energy Commission wrote their report, and in 2006, when the bill was actually written, this occurred right on the heels of the 2003 San Simeon earthquake. So there was a lot of concern on the minds of folks that we had, in fact, adequately identified all the faults in the area, that there were, quoting Don Rumsfeld, no unknown unknowns or even known unknowns. So while the Los Osos fault figures prominently in this suite of values that we have all agreed were some of the primary drivers and contributors to hazard at the Diablo Canyon site, we also took the effort to evaluate other fault systems within the Irish Hills to make sure that there were no surprises. So again, the unknown unknowns, make sure that we can address that, not have any faults that had not been previously recognized, or ones that we do know from the surface have better constraints on the geometry. So let's get into our discussion on the land size and deflection surveys. These are pictures of two of the sources that we use. This is the accelerated weight drop truck. It gives us high resolution, shallow penetration. You can see the spring device back here in the tailgate of the truck. And then these are the Vibra-sized trucks. So typically we ran 4 of these in tandem, all synced together. Each one of these trucks weighs about 65,000 pounds. So together it provides a pretty good impulse into the ground that allows us then to do that deep seismic imaging. This is a map of the data acquisition areas that we acquired information during 2011 and 2012. So let's see, my color choices here. So the light maroon is the area of data acquisition in 2010. And this primarily looked at the larger scale features of the Irish Hills in 2011. And in 2012, we focused our investigations more on the area in and around the Diablo Canyon plant site. So you'll hear today reference to 2011 and 2012 survey. In addition to this larger scale 2011 survey of the entire Irish Hills, we also collaborated with the USGS to update their gravity files for the area, and obtained a lot of new gravity data along the profile routes that we imaged on to help provide that independent constraint on structure that we use for our migrations as well as our inversions. So in 2012, more work here around Diablo Canyon, and then also taking a look at a strip of coastline along the coastal terrace just south of the plant, where we're looking to evaluate cross-cutting faults, primarily the San Luis Bay fault as it came across Point San Luis. So this is actually probably one of the primary examples of being able to do true 3D seismic profiling in the area. In general, this is a very rugged terrain. Access is limited by roads and what we're able to develop permits for and permissions for when we're doing the work. So to go into this a little more in detail now, this is a map of roads and access routes that were imaged in the 2011 campaign with the fiber size and nodes. So the red dots that you see here on the eastern part of the Irish Hills are actually these independent nodes that we call them. It allows a lot more flexibility in putting out seismic stations. Typically these are linked together by cable, but this is a new technology that frees us from the constraints of cable, allows us to put out more widespread three-dimensional or two-dimensional distribution. And the idea here was to use this two-dimensional distribution stations to help us gain a better 3D image of the Los Osos Fault, which is located here on the eastern edge of the Irish Hills. So, but in addition to focusing just on the Los Osos Fault as well, we ran a series of lines through the Irish Hills where we could get access and along the coastal roads around the perimeter to also provide imaging within and throughout the hill area. And you'll see results from those investigations. In addition to that deeper vibra-size investigation, we also did, just to go back for a second. So this vibra-size node profiling covered about 100 line miles of road inside the Irish Hills area. The accelerated weight drop, which is the higher resolution, shallower penetration, covered about 80 line miles in and around the area. And again, you can see where these lines, these profile routes were taken, both in the Irish Hills and out in the Los Osos Valley. And again, the idea was that the vibra-size, accelerated weight drop lines were all coincident so that we could again provide this top to bottom imaging. We talked, so in 2012, kind of pulled in and did a very high resolution survey of the area in and around Diablo Canyon. So data were collected within about a 3-kilometer radius of the plant facility itself, and then high resolution data was collected within about a 1-kilometer radius. So again, because of the high resolution, tighter spacing in the seismograph installations as well as the sourcing. And then finally, this strip to the south of the plant, this was about a 0.5 kilometer by 3.5 kilometer area of coastal terrace, where because of the geometry, flat farmlands were able to actually set out a regular array to do true 3D seismic profiling, similar to the kind of work that we did offshore. Again, it helps to have a regular geometry when you're doing this, just to ease the data processing and data interpretation. All of the data that we're going to be talking about today and all the data that's discussed in the Seismic Imaging Project report for the land is available on the IRIS website. So this is the Incorporated Research Institutions in Seismology. The URL is here. The link to the actual page with the waveform data is here on the bottom, and the report number where all our data is collected is given right here, 14-207. So again, this is our opportunity to provide this data not only to the IPRP, but to the general public and the community in the interest of transparency, and then also as a resource for future generations. And that is the end of my presentation this morning. So now what I'd like to do is hand this over to Steve Thompson, who's going to give us a brief introduction on how this information then is transferred over into the SHAC process. So Mr. Giesman.
Stu, I had a chance to watch the videotape of yours and Norm's presentation to the Diablo Canyon Independent Safety Committee last month. And with respect to your tornado chart, which I think was your chart number 7, Norm said that that was a ranking of probabilistic hazard, and that if it had been done on a deterministic basis, it would be completely different. Now, the license speaks of a design basis in terms of deterministic terms. Why don't you guys ever put the tornado chart up on the deterministic hazards? And what would it look like if you did?
I can't speak to what it would look like if we did, but I can speak to the fact that this tornado plot was used as a planning tool for us in the IPRP to help identify what particular parameters we felt, number one, had impact on the hazard for the plant, and also to identify the sense of uncertainty in these individual parameters and to define targets on how we could go and try to reduce that uncertainty for the projects that we did moving forward. So in a deterministic sense, slip rate on the Hosgary isn't considered because it's a probable, because slip rate returns to frequency, rate of occurrence. In a deterministic, you don't consider rates, you just assume that the earthquake in question happens. So that was probably one of the biggest uncertainties that we saw in the 2011 report, is trying to narrow down that slip rate, which would range from a half a millimeter to 6 millimeters a year.
Well, I think
So this is the way we proceeded forward with coordination from the IPRP.
So I have a different question. So if that's enough on the genesis of the tornado diagram, you said early on the talk that the consideration of the various types of data allow you to arrive at a unique solution for the tectonics of the Irish Hills. And that's a little bit more positive than what's actually in the report, where you acknowledge the potential for other models of the tectonics in the Irish Hills. And so if it's your interpretation that you have effectively ruled out other tectonic models, I'm hoping that the rest of the presentation today will explain how you have at least showed other tectonic models besides the one that's presented here are very low likelihood or have been ruled out. If there is truly a unique interpretation of all of this data, it's not presented quite positively in the report.
All right, well, this is a goal. So we try to...
It's a noble goal.
Yes, it's a noble goal. We'll try to get there moving forward. Okay, moving forward. Let me set you up. Forward, back, the red dot. One up there.
Somebody looking for the
And I'm Steve Thompson with Lettuce Consultants. For this presentation, I am representing myself as one of the members of the SHAC TI team, the Technical Integration Team. And the topic is to inform the IPRP, give them a summary and an update of how the SHAC SSC program, the Seismic Source Characterization Program, how we are considering these AB 1632 results and how we're incorporating these results into our model building that feeds into the probabilistic seismic hazard analysis that's being conducted for the NRC. So the outline of the talk, I'll try to establish and clarify the relationship between the AB 1632 program and the SHAC program. So what are the differences in the objectives of those programs and how they feed into hazard assessment of the plant. I'll also go through briefly the different tectonic models, or in our SHAC program, we're calling these the different fault geometry models that are being developed and are being incorporated into the hazard model. And then the last part will be just some summary statements of just bottom line, how does the SHAC program and our seismic source characterization team, how do we treat these AB 1632 results? And I believe the motivation for this talk fell out of some earlier conversations with the IPRP, and this is in response to one of their prior questions. So first, establishing the relationship between the AB 1632 and SHAC program. So what are their main attributes and differences? AB 1632, the program that we're evaluating in these meetings, the main purpose is to collect and interpret new data with the intent to reduce uncertainty in seismic hazard. We saw this, one of the proxy forms to display this is in the form of these tornado diagrams. The focus is on new data collection, including the interpretation of these new data. It is not set up to be a comprehensive data evaluation and integration program. It's really focused on the new data that are being acquired, how those new data are interpreted. And it's not really a model building program in the sense that it's not set up to be a parallel model building exercise to the SHAC. So the SHAC is, well, I'll just continue into that. Now with the SHAC seismic source characterization, the goals of the seismic source characterization are to consider, evaluate, and integrate all available data, models, and methods to construct a model for use in seismic hazard analysis that captures the center, body, and range of technically defensible interpretations. So it is not a data collection program. The NRC, under the SHAC guidelines, there is no mandate to go out and collect and acquire new data. It is a mandate to build a seismic source characterization that is intended for use in a PSHA, in a probabilistic seismic hazard analysis. And the emphasis of the program is on data evaluation and data integration. There was an open house in San Luis Obispo that was timed with the release of these AB 1632 reports. And this is a poster that was put together to show in a flow chart graphically this relationship between the SHAC programs and the AB 1632 programs in the context of the overall seismic hazard update. And going through from top to bottom, so the seismic hazard update program for the plant, there's the seismic source characterization component, ground motion characterization component, and then site conditions. All of these programs have their own, as PG&E has set it up, their own data compilation, collection, and interpretation parts. And so under these, we see the AB 1632 studies that are collecting and interpreting data that are relevant to the seismic source characterization. And then over here, we have AB 1632 studies that are collecting data that are relevant to the site conditions characterization. So this is well known. This is the organization of a lot of the discussions that the IPRP has had. It follows roughly the format of these meetings. So going a little bit lower through this flow chart, these data and the compilation, collection, interpretation activities from several sources feed in to the seismic source characterization program, the ground motion characterization program, and then on the side, PG&E conducting independently a assessment of the site response and the site conditions for use in hazard. So here, this is the topic of my overview presentation right here. This is what I'm representing at this talk. And we can see graphically that the AB 1632 studies are bringing new data, new analysis, new interpretations into our program. Activities that are funded under PG&E's long-term seismic program, such as the CRADA projects that are given to the USGS, the past analyses, those are being brought into our program. And then other studies that are being presented in the published literature at conferences, other analyses that are being brought into our program are also being considered. The results of this, the evaluation, integration, documentation, this whole program, is the construction of a seismic source model that, along with the ground motion model, is being put together to construct a PSHA for a generic rock site, which gets combined with a site response evaluation to come up with the Diablo Canyon site-specific seismic hazard curves and the ground motion response spectra. And so again, this is just a summary view again. So I hope this clarifies or makes a little bit the distinctions and the relationship between the AB 1632 studies and the type of content that gets passed on downstream to consideration to produce that final seismic hazard model. So our role in the seismic source characterization study, our main focus in developing these fault geometry models, one of the main concerns is understanding the uncertainties and the preferred values in the Hosgri location and the Hosgri dip uncertainty. We saw in that tornado diagram, we've seen in other studies that the Hosgri is the main controlling source for the plant. One of the big efforts has been to understand what are the uncertainties in the trace of the Hosgri closest to the plant, what are those dip uncertainties as constrained by the available data. We're meeting today to discuss more of what we're terming the San Luis Pismo block. What are the locations of faults within that block and what are those dip uncertainties? And one of the important considerations in building a model for use in PSHA is that we want to be able to identify faults that can be modeled as discrete, what are termed in the parlance, line sources. So these are specific planes that are modeled to produce earthquakes at certain magnitude frequency distributions. And for these, this is showing a summary slide that was presented at our workshop 3 back in March. We've developed 3 alternative fault geometry models that do just this. They put together different faults that are modeled as line sources that, in combination, explain the first order kinematics of deformation that's happening in the Diablo Canyon area. And they have associated with them certain ranges of dip uncertainty and, to a lesser extent, fault connectivity uncertainty. Also, as part of the seismic source characterization, we have faults that are part of a more broadly defined aerial source zone. And for these, this is another aspect of our model that uses rates of historical seismicity to have an additional component of deformation, sources of seismic hazard that are in addition to those fault sources, those first order features that we're identifying and that we're trying to model. So what are the requirements for the source characterization team for these fault geometry models? What are these things that we're trying to satisfy where we know we have a source that should be included in the SSC as a line source specifically? So first, we want to explain the patterns and the lake quaternary rates of vertical deformation in the Irish Hills and the surrounding areas. So at Diablo Canyon, the site, one of our first order markers that we want to explain are the onshore and offshore marine terraces. They give us rates and patterns of differential vertical displacement. A requirement of our models is that they must satisfy these observed patterns and rates. We want to explore alternative major styles of tectonic deformation. We want them to be consistent with the regional tectonic model constraints. So as far as the overall tectonic model, we have information from the large plate constraints, information that's available to know the orientation of the major stresses and strains. Any geometric model and kinematic model that we propose, we want it to be compatible with what's generally known about the tectonics of the area. We want the faults, the line sources of interest, to be within the seismogenic crust. We want to have these faults be at those depths and in those locations where large or moderate to large earthquakes nucleate and propagate. right? It's not a satisfying model to restrict ourselves to faults that are only in the upper few kilometers of crust, where there is not the observed association with moderate to large earthquakes. And we really want to understand the uncertainties in the fault dips. And we're doing it in a way that we're not treating uncertainties in fault dips on an individual fault by fault basis, but we're trying to do it to acknowledge certain correlations. So I'll go through this in a little more detail. Another requirement of our fault geometry models is that we want to understand the uncertainties in the slip sense. Specifically, a topic that we've discussed with the IPRP in the past is that the right lateral shear that's in our system should be compatible with not only what we understand about the stress and strain field, but also we want it to be compatible with what we know about the overall slip rate budgets in the system. So for example, what we understand from geodetic data and geodetic constraints, what the overall amount of right lateral shear is. And then lastly, the fault geometry model is designed for use in the PSHA, so it needs to be appropriately simple. It doesn't do any good to have overly complicated models that aren't compatible with the PSHA methodology and how ground motions are calculated. So the data that are available to constrain our uplift rates, this is one of those first requirements that let us know whether we have a line source that we want to really strongly consider and be an important contributor to the seismic hazard of the plan. The data that we have in red, we see the lines that are the emergent marine terraces that are mapped, some additional marine surfaces that are mapped in the interior areas are shown with those polygons, and then we have a set of offshore features that are carved in the bedrock surface that have been interpreted in the shoreline report as being offshore marine terraces as well. And this constitutes a data set that gives us some resolution of the vertical tectonics, both the relative and absolute values. In profile view, now we're going from a map in the inset corner, see the Irish Hills in the plant. This purple line shows the transect from south to north with a bend in the profile here, and this is a plot of uplift rate in millimeters a year versus distance along the line from the south through the bend up to the Montaña de Oro area. And this shows in graphical form this pattern of the rates and both the pattern and rates and uncertainties in those rates as we go through. And what we notice is that through the plant and out across to the north, we have uncertainties in our data points. We have certain data points where there have been measurements of marine terrace back edges, which are paleo-horizontal surfaces. The brackets show the uncertainties in these measurements. And we have a crude pattern of constant uplift rate across the plant. And we also have a pattern that shows as we go south, from turning the corner around the plant, past Olson Hill, Rattlesnake Fault, and then down to Point San Luis, we have a decreasing rate of uplift along the back. Farther to the north, when we get to the Montaña de Oro area, and then step across into the Morro Basin, we go from high, or relatively high uplift rates, down to uplift rates that are at or below zero. So we have a step in the uplift rates at the northern side. That's why we have the Los Osos Fault. We have this change in uplift rate along the southern side. That's why we've been having our San Luis Bay Fault. So there are these primary features that we see in our data that tell us about where the active deformation is happening today in today's current tectonic regime. And so the sources that we consider primarily are the San Luis Bay source, which is in the model responsible for that differential uplift rate, and then the Los Osos fault source, which is responsible for the differential uplift rate at the northern margin of the Irish Hills. So I'll go through quickly the three different fault geometry models. The slides that I'll show are from the workshop 3 that took place in March. There have been some minor modifications to these, but the same general suite of 3 alternative models, and their general features have remained constant. So the outward vergent model. The outward vergent model, it describes the Irish Hills and this San Luis Pismo block as being uplifted by inwardly dipping reverse faults. So on the northern margin, the northeastern margin, these, I should explain this in a little more detail. These shaded areas show the map projection of dipping faults at depth. So where we see the areas in shading, if the crust were transparent, we would be looking down over that map view of the crust down to the base of the seismogenic crust at around 12 kilometers. And this shows that along the northern and northeast margin, we have a Los Osos fault that's dipping to the south and the southwest towards the plant. And on the opposite margin, we have thrusts of the San Luis Bay fault, Wilmar Avenue fault, Oceanic fault that are dipping to the northeast that are underlying that southern margin. So we're describing the kinematics of the currently uplifting Irish Hills and San Luis range as being uplifted above these inwardly dipping faults that are bounding both sides of the range. This geometry and the kinematic concept is that it's consistent with a flower structure where there is also a certain amount of right lateral shear through the system that helps explain the shoreline fault in the model. And yeah, that speaks to the third point. It's compatible with greater amounts of textural shear. Now, to get another view of this particular model and future models, this slide I grabbed is also from Workshop 3, and it shows, this is a map that shows the different fault traces by relative activity. So we have the Holocene active Hosgri fault offshore, parts of the offshore Los Osos fault where we see evidence for Holocene activity, and then lake quaternary faults including the San Luis Bay, shoreline, Los Osos, and then other faults that we know are quaternary active that are more in the interior of the range. And each of these little dots and circles denotes an area where we have site-specific evaluations to bring into the model. The main purpose of this slide is to show these cross-section lines. I showed you a map view one slide ago. The next slide I will show will be a cross-section view so we can understand these geometries relative to the plant in profile. These cross-sections go from A primed as they cross more or less Shell Beach, Pismo Beach, and then on the other side deep into the Edna Valley. B goes through San Luis Hill and to an area just west of San Luis Obispo. C is a profile that goes right through Diablo Canyon, across the Irish Hills, and then across, as shown here. And then D skirts from Point Bouchon across the very northwestern margin of the Irish Hills and then into the Morro Bay Depression. Most of the profiles, or the profiles that I will show in subsequent slides, are along this profile C prime, so we can understand what the model shows as the geometry directly beneath the plant. So for that outward vergent model, this is the view in the upper right. We can see the map and the CC prime is highlighted. So here is the plant on the profile view. Here is the set of Morro Bisley Hills, the volcanic necks. And we can see in this model, we have these oppositely dipping faults where we have the Los Osos fault that's dipping towards the plant at about 60 degrees. The San Luis Bay fault at this latitude is dipping on the order of 75 degrees, and we're showing it as impinging on the shoreline fault. So that's the outward vergent model. The next of the models that we're considering, and again, this is for the Shack SSC that's going into the hazard calculation as we're showing the southwest vergent model. This model has the different attribute where what is mainly responsible for that pattern and those differential rates of uplift is basically slip on more prominent northeast dipping faults. So directly underneath the Irish Hills, we have the San Luis Bay fault, and then shown from Workshop 3, this is the fault as it's impinging on the shoreline fault. And our most current model we have the San Luis Bay Fault extending across the shoreline fault and going all the way out to the Hosgre. So this would be a slightly larger area where the plant is being underlain by a big south virgin or north dipping thrust ramp. Farther to the southeast, we have a similar thing where the Wilmar Avenue and the Oceano faults are large north dipping thrust ramps, and then the offshore we show a change of virgins with the offshore Los Osos. So this describes the same pattern of data. It has to be compatible with those same general constraints within their uncertainties, and it has moderate dips on the San Luis Bay Fault, again a big north dipping structure, and steeper dips on a Los Osos back thrust, as we'll see. This one is compatible with lesser amounts of dextral shear than in that outward virgin model, but it's still within the range of uncertainty that we have for the data that's here on the plan. This is showing the southwest virgin model in cross-section view. This is the same cross-section C to C prime that goes through the plant. And this shows the San Luis Bay as a 45-degree dipping ramp that in this case again is shown as impinging on the shoreline fault. In our more current models, it is allowed to cross-cut the shoreline fault and extend to very close to the surface. And again, the Los Osos fault is shown as a steeply dipping back thrust that may be an independent seismic source in this model. It may rupture sympathetically with moderate to large earthquakes on that San Luis Bay fault. Okay, it's a different kinematic construct. It's a slightly different description of the tectonics. It's compatible with the same data constraints that we have. The last one that we're considering is the northeast virgin model. With this one, the same topographic area of interest is now being uplifted by mostly a southwest or south and southwest dipping fault, a northeast virgin fault that is the Los Osos. And in contrast, the San Luis Bay to the south has been delegated a lesser role of a back thrust. It is now more of that that secondary fault that is responding and adjusting to primary motion being on the Los Osos. So with this one, we have a south-dipping north virgin ramp for the Los Osos fault beneath the Irish Hills and offshore. Lesser important hazard, but we think in this kinematic construct it makes the most sense to have the dominant virgins change and to still have the Oceano and Wilmar Avenue, the primary ramps that underlie the rest of the St. Louis range. This in cross-section view has a Los Osos fault that's dipping at about 50 degrees towards the plant and a San Luis Bay back thrust play at around 70 degrees. Okay, so that's an overview of the tectonic models that the SHAC program is considering. Those are the ones that are moving forward into the model. Now, just in a summary, the third part of my presentation is how does the SHAC model treat AB 1632 results? And specifically, we're looking at this topic of the San Luis Pismo block. So we're treating the AB 1632 results as one of many data sources that are available to our team to build the seismic source characterization. We're considering, as we review the report, we're considering the data advantages, which are many. These are new data that are available to us that heretofore were not available. They've given us a new opportunity to really examine and think through a logical tectonic history of the Irish Hills and the Pismo Basin. But we're also considering the data limitations. We're considering the important limitations of the very difficult situations under which these data were collected and the challenges in the processing that results from that acquisition and also the challenges from the geologic environment. We're considering, somewhat related, is how interpretable are these data? Are these data a clear image where there is very little ambiguity about whether the interpretations that we see are unique? Also, whether or not these, I'm sorry, that's getting into the last one. But the data interpretability, one of the things our team is looking at and considering are realistically, given all the challenges that are faced with the processing, do these data, are they convincingly and compellingly interpretable, or is that not with 100% confidence? And then lastly, one of the things we're considering are, we have been given in these reports proponent model interpretations of the data. These proponent interpretations have to be viewed in the light of, are these the unique interpretations of these data? Are alternative interpretations permissible? Would these alternative interpretations be as compelling, more compelling, less compelling, etc.? So with respect to the tectonic models, this larger view of how we're considering the results, the ONSIP results are very supportive of the main tenets of the outward virgin model. So a model that we have been developing, and as AB 1632 is coming together with results with their program, the outward virgin model, which is a compelling model given what's known about the kinematics of the area, the geology of the data, a lot of the main interpretations and factors that the ONSIP has found and articulates is very supportive of that model. We don't believe that the ONSIP results are sufficiently definitive to preclude other models. So we think other models are allowable. And in fact, two of the three models, the Southwest Virgin and the Northeast Virgin models, in detail at the shallow surface, they're not consistent with the interpretations that are presented with the ONSIP. So we are allowing very directly in our seismic source building for hazard, we're carrying forward in that program interpretations that differ from the interpretations that are presented in these AB 1632 reports. And that's largely because there are other data that bear on the tectonic model. We think that we are giving consideration to some of the limits of these data and their interpretability, and that's part of a healthy integrated program. A last aspect of how the seismic source characterization model treats the AB 1632 results. One of the AB 1632 results is a chapter 12, which is a response to some of the proponent views of Dr. Hamilton. So in summary, how we as a SHAC are treating these. With respect to the Diablo Cove fault, the SHAC concurs with these chapter 12. The analysis and the conclusions that are presented in Chapter 12, the SHAC is adopting. We do not consider the Diablo Cove fault to be a technically defensible seismic source or seismic hazard to the plant. With regards to his hypothesis of the San Luis Range IOF thrust, there's general concurrence in the SHAC with the analysis and the conclusions that are put forward in the Chapter 12 in the AB 1632 report, Chapter 12. And mainly that the specific proponent model that's articulated in both Dr. Hamilton's testimony and his Workshop 2 presentation is not technically defensible as specifically defined. So it is not considered one of the alternative line sources. However, there are many aspects, the general aspects that he puts forward in his proponent view of what could be accommodating uplift of the Irish Hills and the San Luis Range, we think are quite technically defensible. And we feel that those are captured in the Southwest Virgin model and in the San Luis Bay fault source and how that's characterized. And that is the last slide.
So I could summarize in the tornado diagram and so on. And so we can't know if they're decreasing the uncertainty in seismic hazards unless we follow through and say, how does this affect the model? How important are these factors? And so the key question, I think, is have you evaluated the seismic hazard, the range of seismic hazard you would get from these three different tectonic models? How important are they in terms of seismic hazard results if you put all your weight on the outward virgin versus all the weight on the northeast virgin? And then, so how significant are these different models is the first question. And then going back to how well supported are each of these models by the data, how are you weighting them on a logic tree then?
Okay.
What's your overall evaluation of how likely each one is to be correct?
Yeah. With respect to the first question, we are doing the final calculations now with the updated ground motion models. The results that I can speak to were presented at Workshop 3 in March, where Nick Greger had a presentation where he showed the hazard contribution by tectonic model. And that was one that considered exactly what your question, what is the difference to hazard if we put full weight behind the outward virgin model versus southwest versus northeast? And the results of that were that there was an increase in marginal hazard, so hazard did go up with the southwest virgin model compared to the other two. The other two, there was very little daylight and marginal hazard curves between them. So with respect to hazard of the plant that was presented at Workshop 3, the northeast virgin and the outward virgin model were very comparable, but there was a difference between those two and the southwest virgin, with the southwest virgin being slightly higher.
And in terms of the slip rates on all the faults were essentially the same in each of those models. And one of the questions I had to follow up on that was, your outward virgin model is built with the idea this is a transpressional model.
Mm-hmm.
And all of your control is on the vertical tectonics. So how much horizontal slip can you put into your transpressional model?
Yeah.
And does that make a difference?
That's a great question. The differences in slip rate, there are differences in slip rate on these bounding faults from model to model. So for example, the Los Osos fault has a slip rate that is on the order of 20-30% higher in the northeast virgin model compared to the other two, because again, the constraint is on the vertical rate and we're exploring uncertainties in depth. Right? We also have carried forward the idea of what is the appropriate differential vertical rate to look at. And with the northeast virgin model, we're looking at the full uplift of the Irish Hills north, including subsidence in the eastern block. So there are differences in the dip slip rates. And the past sensitivities have shown that although on the tornado diagram, the slip rate on the Los Osos fault does move around quite a bit, it is not as hazard significant as some of the other parameters, right? But your other question about the lateral slip components and how much does that matter? What we've carried forward is large uncertainty in what the slip vector on those faults would be, what the rate would be. So we're allowing there to be variable amounts of pure dip slip to getting to be an appreciable component of lateral slip. And so that also increases the slip rate. That's how it's most directly tied to an increase in hazard, as you suspect. There are other parts of our model that are introducing more of that lateral slip. Our aerial source zone, which I didn't speak much about, also over largely weights most of that shear going into an additional strike slip component. And in our assessment, any additional increase in lateral slip that would go into the Irish Hills and into that outward virgin tectonic model would have to be subtracted from the Hosgri. And so basically you're taking the same slip rate budget, you're taking slip rate from the Hosgri, and you're just moving locations. So if it was offshore of the plant, now the plant just turns around and looks onshore and there's that same slip rate at very comparable or greater source to site distances. And so really in the sensitivities that we've done, it's been a wash. You also had a question about the relative weighting of these tectonic models. The weighting, we are giving an appreciable weight to the outward virgin model and to the southwest virgin model. We're giving less weight to the northeast virgin model compared to those other two. And it is a combination of factors that really go into supporting the tenets of these models. And with the outward virgin model, one of the major considerations is that it's compatible with the ONSIP results and A very meaningful part of that is in the geologic reconstruction and putting together the whole synthesis of what the interpretation of the seismic reflection data is and how that fits to restoring the geology and running that tectonic history backward and forward. It fits a lot of the data and the models that are brought to bear on that question. And so we see it to be very compatible with looking at the tectonic history and the development of the Irish Hills and the Pismo Basin. But it's also, just on its own, the outward virgin model is also one that we were considering, but we have refined and probably upweighted given the onset results. But the alternative model, the Southwest Virgin model, which in detail one could say could be rejected from the interpretation of the seismic data that's being presented. Nonetheless, there are other data that have to bear in the SHAC process that would lead us to say that Southwest Virgin model is also quite, it's compelling.
I'd like to raise a rather fundamental issue that the report doesn't address at all. I would call it knowledgeable humility. The seismic profession, I think, has learned in recent years how difficult, and I should say impossible it is, to really determine the full extent of potential seismic catastrophe. I read this in the literature and brilliantly told us what you know, but from the point of view of someone who's served in public policy and the state asked for this report, it seems to me the report is totally incomplete without a chapter at the beginning to tell the layman that you have learned over the last decade that you don't know, to a much greater extent than we thought we knew 10, 15, 20 years ago. Now, I may be wrong in saying that, but that subject needs to be discussed with the same degree of thoroughness and insight as you discuss the things that you have learned, because we are dealing with the question of whether you can determine how severe the earthquake threat is. And if you know that you really don't know, you ought to say that. And to the extent that you know, you ought to say that. This is a subject that is out there in the literature. Certainly post-Fukushima, I read article after article where reputable seismologists were making statements that we're gathering evidence all over the world that we really are not as insightful about knowing what these dangers are as we thought were. Now, we've learned a lot of techniques to learn a lot better, but we've also learned that even with those techniques, they were not God, a long way from God. And that without something like that in the report, people read what you know as being gospel when you know it's not gospel. So I make that plea so that the report will have more credibility and more believability by people that understand that there is some question of whether you can determine or not.
Yes, that's one of the things that Steve went into here was the AB 1632 studies and the SHAC studies, and none of these are the whole thing, and the complete seismic hazard analysis for any point on the Earth's surface will be completed in a million years, and we will never know in our lifetimes what it
But the report
actually
started
is.
saying that.
Well, but these data gathering efforts are important for decreasing our uncertainty. The goal is to know a little bit better something about the parameters that are important for seismic hazard, so that they can go into an analysis system where we can consider how much we don't know.
Reminds me of the air quality people that brag about how much cleaner the air is which is still unhealthy.
Well, I think,
And it's a good point, and we're doing our best, I think, is all I can say.
I think it's a significant purpose for why we're around the table at this point. And jumping off on that, maybe I could ask Steve a couple of questions. Particularly, how you, in evaluating the hazard from each of your three models, how do you deal with the uncertainty of the measured uplift data? Because you're having to make some assumptions, it would seem. In particular, as I looked at what you were hanging dates on, there were a lot of discontinuous little pieces of terrace here and terrace there. So, so what uncertainties do we have? How are they accommodated in the getting from the model to a hazard?
Yep.
And then I have a question about your SHAC team's interpretation of the seismic.
Okay, we're not. I'll definitely answer them the best I can, but this is a meeting about AB 1632,
right.
not SHAC.
Right.
The uncertainty we have in the terrace uplift rate data, those feed into uncertainties in the absolute rates that go into our slip rates. So those uncertainties are carried forward there. And with regard to the extent and the completeness of the data, for example, we do have emergent coastal marine terraces on the coastal side of the Irish Hills. On the interior side of the Irish Hills in the San Luis range, we don't. What we do have is we drive along and we see topography, and we can look for any remnants or other geomorphic surfaces, and we can do a bunch of maybes. But we have more quantitative data where the uncertainties can be quantified within the range of the coast. And then in places where we don't, we rely on proxies. And we concern ourselves with if we're, have we adequately captured the uncertainties so if we're wrong, it's meaningful for hazard. And that's what we pay attention to.
So really, that's the frame with which we now look at seismic data, and going back to the tornado diagram, in this large scale of the report, PG&E has asserted some reduction in uncertainties in certain of the important parameters. To my IPRP colleagues, as we read through our analysis, we come up in many cases with wider ranges of uncertainty for specific slip rates and other things. And I think one of the things we need to do is go back and confirm whether the reductions that are posited by PG&E are actually defensible. That's just an issue that I think IPRP has to wrestle with. But you had also referenced, Steve, in making some assessments of what the onset seismic data do or don't do in terms of speaking to the likelihood or unlikelihood of the models. And I was just curious as to who is doing that. What you have a team where that's doing that? How is that being handled?
Okay.
in between workshops?
Okay, very good. The team was present at the SHAC Workshop 3. The team has evolved a little bit, but the SHAC Workshops 1, 2, and 3 were opportunities to see the team members. We have representatives from academia. We have representatives from the team. And the specialties, we have a seismologist, we have quaternary geologists, we have people with expertise in seismic reflection data interpretation. And then we rely on a staff to broaden the expertise that we have. And as far as what's the venue, what's the format for us to be able to look through and vet these data, we have working meetings where we get together as a team and discuss them. We've had presentations where the interpretation team, since the results have first started to come out, we have met periodically to ask them about the data processing, how interpretations are going, the uncertainties. So we've had periodic chances to check in.
So as you know from the working meeting that some IPRP members attended with you and others week before last, we're going to get into the seismic data here, and we had talked a lot at that working meeting about what the data might show or not show, what it might constrain or not constrain. And I just wanted to confirm that your SHAC colleagues are awaiting some further commentary from this process as to what that seismic data might be.
We're always interested in what you have to say.
Thank you.
Question? Another question in the back? Yeah, go ahead.
So, is your team, this is Gurbakh Scalan with the Energy Division, is your team going to review the newly provided data by these studies that PG&E has done? And are you going to provide your own interpretation, your own evaluation?
We are reviewing the data and the reports as they come out. We're reviewing this both as a data resource and as a resource of advancing proponent interpretations of the data. With certain parts of the AB 1632 reports and the data, we are doing our own reanalysis. In other parts, I guess the best thing to say is that we are considering them both as data sets that are being brought in, that are generally available to us to understand and incorporate with other data, and we are viewing very closely the interpretations of these data as advanced through these reports.
Yeah,
so we are doing both.
Staff, I'm interested in, more people looking at it with expertise and analyzing it, evaluating it, because that would add to our knowledge here. So you are going to do that.
The schedule right now, in order to keep the federal schedule, we are basically completing our model, and we are putting it in. And so the opportunity is to have independent parties go through these data and come up with other interpretations. That is not going to be done, that could not be done in time to go into the seismic source characterization and the seismic hazard model that is due in March of 2015. However, the seismic hazard of Diablo Canyon, as Chris said, it is an ongoing process, right? Once the final report goes in March 2015, that by no means is the end of seismic hazard study for Diablo and other facilities.
I don't want to go off course, but I'm curious. NRC is going to have PG&E's findings, and your findings?
ESPG.
Oh, okay. So, I thought the shack process was with other seismic.
He's not at the independent review. He's working for PG&E.
Oh, okay, okay.
The shack process is being sponsored by PG&E. The
Okay.
power plants sponsor the shacks that are being performed. The guidelines that we're following are NRC guidelines.
Got it. Okay. I thought maybe you're working independently
Yeah.
with other state agencies who are
Not
involved in
not with other state agencies. Yeah, the
Okay.
team that we put together is being sponsored by PG&E. Following the guidance, we are representing ourselves in this team and following the process that's independent of PG&E, but PG&E is the sponsor.
Okay.
Are there any plans to have another public meeting of the shack prior to March?
No, there's not.
So this is the last chance to have a discussion about how this data.
A shack workshop, we don't plan to have another shack workshop, but there will be a third
Right.
IPRP meeting in January.
Right. And will the shack present at that meeting as well, or be present at that meeting as well?
The topic.
Good morning,
of that-
CPUC staff. This is Michelle Cook, Deputy Executive Director. Using the clock here in the main lobby, it is now 11:17 a.m. and time to begin our participation in the Great California Shakeout. Please drop, shut, and hold on. Grab another your bed and grab your table.
On Wednesday, Thursday.
All right, well, everybody, let's see how limber we are today. You got to duck and cover. This is the purpose of the drill. We need to do these
I don't
things.
have enough room.
What are the probabilities?
Well, so what are you gonna do? Yeah, so I'm sorry folks, but this is what we do at PG&E. There is a drill and we're expected to participate. So we'll participate if you don't want to. You don't need to, but. They just wanted to give us an opportunity to be a little more. I know, we're back at school, huddled under our little desk.
I'm sharing this.
This will be, remember the IPRP meeting where we all had to climb under the table?
At least no one shoved anyone out of the way.
That's right.
I was considering running.
Is that, well, we're supposed to wait until the monitor comes and dismisses us. Yeah.
Shallow press over.
It's a bigger desk for you. Your legs are too long.
That's what I think in mind.
Okay, well, we did record it on tape that we were all under the table.
No. But I think the thing that people are worried that you trip.
Yeah.
Stuff falls and you trip, it's not worth it.
That's the end of the Great California Shakeouts. Thank you for your participation.
Yeah.
I went bolting out, and as I went out, I
When he was out of
it was out for the night of the summer. It's all okay. Full screen.
Yes, sir.
First time I thought of it, now I'm here. Yeah? My window shaking. I was disappointed that they don't have more often after that. Or Nevada now.
So I'm Dan O'Connell with Blue Grove, geophysicist. I'm going to go through the onshore seismic data. And I'm going to focus most of the presentation on the resolution of the seismic reflection data and the tomographic data, and briefly go through the acquisition. Stu covered some of that, the essentials of the processing, particularly as they relate to how the data can be used and interpreted, and then finish with implications for how you use the reflection tomographic data in particular with respect to what you can and can't see at different depth scales, length scales, and types of structure. So we have data actually from 3 years, 2 years of acquisition of seismic reflection data, first in 2011 over a large area, and then we added in and merged in data from the 2012 survey around the plant in the tomography and some of the other processing so that it'd be available and integrate into the larger area. And then there's a small scale data that was collected on a terrace. I'm not going to talk about that here because that's not really germane to the larger scale onset interpretation. And the key thing to mention about this is that the nodes stayed live and recorded all the shots while they were deployed. So it isn't like a line of receivers recording the shots. A whole network of receivers would be live, and when we had all of them live, they'd be throughout the hills from the south coast to the north and recording the shot points, which are blue and covered in red by the receiver locations on the roads. So we had a 3D network, at least for tomography, of live stations and for some reflection processing. The AWD provided, more detailed shallow constraints that were really important in getting the tomography up closer to the surface along key areas, and it really helped feed that into the key aspects of the reflection process. But the third year data in 2013 was really a critical component that was identified after initial processing of the first 2 years of data. That's, we came to the conclusion that in many areas we just didn't have sufficient constraints on velocity structure to successfully, work through the processing steps to create seismic reflection depth images, and that we needed some supplementary data, and in particular gravity data could fill in and regularize, the distribution of information throughout the hills. And so the USGS went out and added, more stations, and particularly along some of our profiles, our seismic profiles, so that we had constraints over a broader area to incorporate with all the seismic data we had and improve our resolution of seismic velocities, which were a key component of the reflection processing. And I just want to point out, we tried, permit what we need to get the kind of coverage you'd like to have to do seismic reflection imaging here in 3D. You'd like that, you need to have the sources everywhere, and you need to have the receivers everywhere. This is a very rugged terrain. It's not the Himalayas, but it's really difficult. There are a lot of cliffs. There are poison oak jungles. It's a really difficult area just physically to access. But in addition, there are a lot of different landowners, and we would have, the industry when they went in here and did 2D, they used a helicopter crew and drills and explosives in the 80s. We weren't permitted to do that. I asked to do, I need Primacord, I need to go in and really do 3D. It's just not something we could get the permits to do. Our primary permit requires non-invasive, no drilling, surface only. So that left us with the sources we use and primarily confined us, exclusively confined us along roads for 2011 for all the sourcing. And through the generosity of private landowners in San Luis Obispo County, we were able to get coverage of receivers off roads, mostly in the northern Irish Hills. So we collected 3 different types of data to look at different, parts of the crust and, focus on the shallow to the deep as much as possible. So, the key processing steps was that, even though we had things that looked like 2D lines, particularly from the A2D, everything was processed in 3D. There's a lot of crooked and irregular geometries, and even the straight geometries. Everything was processed for both the travel and topography and all the seismic reflection processing. And really the key thing after we'd gone through the initial processing was that newly available technology developed by Shell and Giottomo to do the joint travel time gravity inversion. These really got us to a point where we could see enough signal in the seismic reflection processing to update the velocity models and actually do the depth imaging. And I'm going to focus in another technology that was really crucial in all this was the development, and it's been an industry thing, of the beam depth migrations to actually be able to do imaging to considerable depth through very complicated structure. And just to illustrate, this is sort of a standard method of doing, the depth imaging. You take all the data that's in time and space, and you convert it into space and depth. And it's a fairly involved process, which involves what we call migration, which is taking the data that's offset, separated source and receivers, and putting them into common image points. And so this is a synthetic model that industry has available to evaluate different processing approaches. So the colors show a very strong velocity variation from going across folds and faults in the Canadian foothills, which is an area that's well known to be a difficult area to do seismic imaging and shares a lot of similar structural components to what the Irish Hills in terms of, they're complex and steep folds, faults that can be steep to low dips, and a lot of velocity variations. And so this is synthetic data. You know what the true model is. You generate data going through that model, and then you try to process it, and see what structure and artifacts come out of that processing. And here, what you can see is this very clean delineation of shallow structure, and then there's degradation and noise introduced in the processing, and the imaging becomes less effective the deeper you go in the model. So, this is, the beam migration approach, and, we're, first and foremost, our objective is to look as deep as possible, and it actually gets quieter and more accurate the deeper you go. And so this was really a crucial technology that we had to validate under nuclear quality assurance software. So we had to go through a whole cycle of testing to confirm that it was performing appropriately, and then apply that to the data. Okay, so I briefly went through this before, but the crucial steps were actually doing the tomography that fed back to getting us the information we needed, velocities and statics, which are the little shifts in the traces, so that we used a static approach that guaranteed that we didn't introduce false structure and we didn't remove structure like faults by being surface consistent and only using the first breaks. And then combined with this beam depth migration, we were able to do velocity updates and actually confirm independently that we could make relatively small adjustments, like 5 or 10% in the tomographic velocities and what we call common image gatherers, and update and improve the velocity model and produce the depth images. So we end up in we image acoustic crustal structure, acoustic impedances. The correspondence between that and geologic structure you might image, depends on your geology. So things that we don't image at any depth. We don't image vertical beds, scraping, even if these have velocity variations. That energy doesn't come back to the surface. So, we don't image things that don't produce, a contrast in the product of the velocity and density, even if, they have, in fact, there are geologic contrasts. We don't image like the steep limbs of box folds if they exist. Things that are in large impedance contrast between sufficiently thick geologic units. And I'll get in specifically what I mean by sufficiently thick geologic units as a function of the different data types we used and the depth ranges we're talking about. And we can see often the truncation of impedance contrast against steep faults because they'll cross-cut the section comprehensively, and so they're very first order structure. So we have 3 different types of seismic data that we use to do 3 different types of depth imaging. So we have the 2D AWD, which is focused on relatively near surface to 1 to 3 kilometers. We have deeper 2D vibroseis, which is this process, even it was processed within the line using data close to the line and binned in 2D, but migrated in 3D. And then we have the deepest imaging that's available in a fairly limited area because of the irregularity of the data acquisition. We extracted 2-dimensional profiles through 3D volume from the 3D migration of all the 2011 vibroseis node data. And then the other part I'm going to show and explain some of the results from the 3D tomography, both in terms of velocity and density imaging, which gives very large scale overview of sort of first order characteristics of the velocity and density structures that you can correlate with geology. So I'm going to start with the shallowest high-res data, and I'm going to focus on an area, part of the design, the layout of this was in the first year we cover as large an area as possible and gather as much information. And also, we didn't want to go back and have to permit and inconvenience people. We wanted to get as much as we could done in 1 year to go after issues related to Los Osos fault structure in the northern Irish Hills. So I'm going to focus on 2 lines related to the Los Osos fault area, 2 lines that cross or are close to that. So you can sort of look at what is and isn't, resolvable in some of this data, specifically related to a particular range of structures that we were interested in trying to image or image structure related to those faults. So the first one is AWD 150. So This is 3 kilometers of depth. It's 1-to-1. I'm not going to show on any of these usually all the faults interpreted from onset, just the main ones we're discussing. But it's an opportunity to look at, well, what are the range of dips you can see in the data as a function of the data type and depth and position. So this image will be reproduced, and I'll have different panels over here. So there is a limit, given the geometry of how we acquire the data and what the velocities turn out to be. And we didn't know what the velocities would be. It was part of the discovery of the investigation in 2011, and we covered 80 to 100 miles of area that didn't have velocity measurements before to the depths that we're trying to work. And so, we discovered, that there were a very wide range of velocities throughout this area. But in general, for this AWD source, our dominant frequencies are less than 60 cycles per second. And so, once we got below the soil and out through the weathering layer into velocity associated with rock, we could resolve dips steep that would provide energy that still came into our cable. So we could resolve dips of 60 or 70 degrees for most of these units in the shallower part of the section. So for instance, these steeply dipping units dipping toward this interpreted fault position, yeah, these are right at the limit, but they're within the range we can resolve. And so you see a dip discordance up against this interpreted fault with flatter dips on the footwall and steeper dips in the hanging wall. Okay. Similarly, there's a limit to just, even if the bedding is very thin with very large velocity variations, there's a limit to just how thin we can actually resolve bedding. And again, it's a function of velocity. So I looked at, made a list here for a dominant frequency less than max, and said, as you go into the higher velocity units, and most of this section you're going to look at here, I'll show a velocity overlay, is generally in the range of from here down to about here. And so generally, somewhere in the order of 50 to 100 feet is the thinnest bed you can see, and that's why this thicker. This appearance of beds, we're not going to see all the fine stratigraphy of sedimentary units that are well suited for seismic imaging. We're going to only see a thicker representation. And the thickness will increase going down because the velocities increase going down. And also we lose the frequencies, so our dominant frequencies become lower because they're just losses due to scattering and anelastic attenuation that reduce the maximum frequency that returns as the energy goes deeper and does that two-way path. So if you look at, for us, a critical, question is what are the wavelengths of folds that you can resolve? Because in the Irish Hills, if you've been in the Irish Hills, you can see folds on scales of inches, literally, feet, tens of feet, hundreds of feet. Well, what can we see in the seismic reflection data? Well, we can't resolve, even in this highest resolution data, we can't resolve folds that you can typically walk through on the hills, that will be, 50 feet. Generally for the velocities we have, we're going to start in the low 100s and go, up to several hundred feet. That's the smallest fold we can see, and we can only see that at depth. Because, as I'll show it in the next slide, the overlay, we can't image even in this data because it's still, at a certain coarseness of resolution, even though it's much tighter spacing than industry standard. We can't resolve, detail that, and it ranges by the line how crooked it is. The top, 100, a couple hundred feet. So we can't track, folds up typically, not that they would necessarily be expressed in the soil, but we can't always track them all the way up as shallow as you'd like. But there are folds here that are, these are about the shortest wavelength folds that we can resolve. And as we get to, as we go deeper, the length of the folds we resolve gets larger because again we lose frequencies, and the scale of folds we can resolve get to be, a couple hundred to 500 feet. So we can see these large scale folds in the subsurface, but our resolution will decrease as we look downward. Okay, and so when you look at the velocity overlay, so this overlay is a smooth version of the very large scale tomographic velocity model on top of the reflection data. So the cell sizes for this tomography are 200 feet on the side, horizontally and vertically. And so there's additional smearing. So you can see an association of high velocities with some of these strong reflectors, but the tomography is smeared relative to what you see in a reflection image. You know, they're different resolutions, but the tomography provides a large scale idea of what's going on in the velocity structure in the subsurface. So the low velocity areas up here are generally muted off because we don't have sufficient data there to do reflection imaging. And you can see in an area like we were in this line, we went through a river valley. There were still some reverberations from the alluvium leaking down in the section. So we did various deconvolution and demultiples, which are reverberations that are not what you're interested in imaging in the subsurface, and they overprint your reflectivity, so you can still see some of them leaking down through just below our mute zone here. But you can see, for instance, just the bottom out in Los Osas Valley. You can see a little bit of the stratigraphy of the lower part of the Ternary section sitting on top of Franciscan units. So I'm going to move to the next deeper sort of type of data, which is a 2D processing of fiber-sized line. And 2D processing can be successful, particularly when the structure is relatively two-dimensional. That is, it has a clear dip direction and it changes along strike are relatively small. Generally, we didn't have any choice about the orientation. A lot of these lines, they had to stay on the roads. Generally, the roads were not oriented in the dip direction. So, I'm showing you, our best case scenarios. Many of these lines, help tie things together, but the imaging is degraded just because they're not in the orientation of the predominant folding. They are sometimes very crooked, and all those things decrease, the signal to noise in the images you obtain. So this one was acquired with all the receivers live in this direction and out to here, but there isn't enough what we call aperture out here. We don't have receivers going further out. So I'll show you some end effects here. They're not strong end effects here because we have a long set of the line live to go ahead and be able to migrate that energy back to the line and put it in an appropriate subsurface position. So this now is a line that goes, only, again, it's about 3 kilometers here because we're limited by, the aperture, or how wide the spread of live receivers is. But here, this is an important line because it has some wells near the line. None of the wells is actually on the line. They have to be projected in the line. And so we have some geologic sampling of the subsurface here that we can compare to the seismic reflection data. Now here, we're looking at generally a lower frequency range. We're trying to look deeper, so we're going to look at larger scale structure. But the velocities here become so low, there's a dune field of sand up here, low velocity sands and other things, and then some of the youngest tertiary rocks that have some of the lowest velocities. And so for the acquisition we used to cover the whole area, we can't see the steep dips in these lowest velocity, youngest tertiary units. They are what we call alias. So the steep dips may appear as apparent shallow dips, and there's a lack of ability to image those dips in the shallow part of the surface. But once we get deep enough into the older part of the tertiary, into the Franciscan, then we're in the velocity range, generally, that we don't have aliasing, and we can start to see, steep dips, folds, shallow dips, truncation of steep dips against, dips in the opposite direction. And so, for instance, you can see structure deeper that does reflect the first order, the acoustic structure of the subsurface. But again, because we're operating at lower frequencies, the thinnest bed we can see keeps getting thicker because we're at lower frequencies, and we tend to look deeper where the velocities are higher. So here, even if there's two types of beds, like a sandstone, high velocity sandstone, juxtaposed against a shale, and each one is 50 feet thick, we just don't see that contrast coming back from those. We can't see that level of detail. And then again, for us, because we're interested in looking at folds and faults, the wavelengths of folds that we can resolve, are longer. Now they're larger scale, but you can see, this, is a several thousand foot wide fold. The velocities aren't in the high end range here. This is a resolvable fold in the hanging wall of this ONSIP interpreted Edna B fault, where you have a dip discordance. You generally have the dips toward the fault in this direction on the hang wall, and then dips on this direction from the foot wall. That is a first order resolvable feature. But some of the shorter wavelength folds that may exist, because we see very short wavelength folds in the subsurface, we're not going to see the folds because they're aliased up here to first order. We're not going to see the true dips on those folds. But you won't see folds, that get shorter wavelength than 500 feet or so. So there's a spatial filtering of what you can see. There is, this example of end effects, artifacts on this end of the line, because the line goes a little further. There's a little more aperture here, but we start running out of coverage. Where on this side of the line, we had another 15,000 feet of live receivers going this way, so we could actually bring and migrate the data back into the line. So, you have some first order structure you can look at here that is, we think, useful in terms of considering, models of faults and structure here. So the last type of data is the lowest frequency, largest scale data. This is the kind of data we attempt to look as deep as possible over its largest areas. And those are data extracted where we had, 3D coverage, we have sources on both sides, receivers on both sides out here. So this is an area where if you look at what would be an ideal 3D acquisition geometry, we can get to about a third or a half of what we were able to accomplish with a true 3D acquisition down here. So it's useful to extract some profiles out of the areas where you do have good 3D coverage and look at sort of first order structure. Okay. Now here we're looking at even lower frequencies. We're really trying to look deep. So we're looking at frequencies less than 20 hertz. So again, the whole upper part of the tertiary section here is all, relatively low velocity stuff. We can't resolve the dips up here, which means we can't resolve really a lot of folds or details in the tertiary structure with this processing approach. But the Franciscan, which is on the north side here, has some larger wavelength local folds that are resolvable to first order, and because the dip there in this velocity range, so they're not aliased, so you can actually see some of the fold axes. And to first order, there are some large velocity contrasts within the Franciscan up here apparent in the topography, so that you have up to 50% velocity contrast between different units. So it's pretty reflective up in here. And so we can see it looks like very thick bedding because, again, we're at lower frequencies and higher velocities. We can't see, beds in some areas that are less than 150 or 200 feet thick. But we can see very large contrast within the Franciscan, which, now we're looking at a scale like 5 kilometers there, so about almost 6 kilometers bottom of the section. You're looking at stuff that's alternating almost, the scale of units on the scale of a kilometer or so in the Franciscan. And you can see, again, this is an interpreted northern Pismo syncline bounding fault, the Etna B. It correlates with truncation of dominant Franciscan structure, and this structure, no matter who processed the data, was persistent in all the different variants of doing processing here. So this is a very sort of first order structure. But there are these what we call second order structures, they're sort of ephemeral spatially. You'll see them in a line, you'll tie to another line, and you'll see that fold axis disappear. These, we're trying to find what can we map to first order, and that's something like this large-scale truncation here, not focusing so much on these shallow, disconnected structures. So, the wavelengths, again, 500 to 1,000 feet wavelengths. You're not going to see smaller wavelength folding in this section. Often in some areas, you'll have the good fortune of velocities almost uniquely associate with different types of geologic units. An example would be the Great Valley Formation in the Great Valley Cretaceous. The sandstones will generally be, on 4.5 kilometers per second, and the shales will be 2.5 kilometers per second. It's like you look at the velocity and you see a very characteristic, unique association of velocities with particular geologic units. We've covered a large area here, and in a key velocity range, there are a number of different units that all can have the same velocity. So velocity alone is not diagnostic of a particular geologic unit. Okay, and so the only thing that really stands out as unique, besides soil, is the diabase. It has such a high velocity, up to 6.2 kilometers per second, that there aren't even the highest velocity Franciscan anywhere I've seen it in California. It generally doesn't get over about 5.4 or 5.5. Okay, and that would be the mating part up in the eastern side of the coast. So we can, at least in some areas, see that something is really probably truly associated with just diabase. But we have found that even in the Pismo syncline, there are places where, in the one deep well log we have, they've noted that there is dolomitic alteration of both the lower part of the Monterey and the upper part of the tertiary Bispo, and they have unusually high velocities. It was really a surprise to us. Okay, and they overlap with velocities we associate with the pillow basalts in Avila Bay and some of the other Franciscan structure in Cretaceous sandstone. So in these areas, there's not a unique association of velocity. But velocities themselves, are useful, as I said, and I'll give an illustration with the diabase. Another real surprise was just how much subsurface expression we see of diabase. So, I'm now doing an overlay at 7 feet above sea level. The yellow to red are the higher velocities, and the blue is a low velocity. That's a deep section of alluvium on a marine terrace. Here's the power plant coastline. On the right, you can see the magenta is ray coverage. It's an indicator of how much we've sampled the subsurface and the topography. So this is really dominating because we have literally in some cells hundreds of thousands of rays. So it would be probably more diagnostic to do like a logarithmic color scale because we still have hundreds of rays in other cells. So it's not like we don't have coverage. It's just a lot less intense than some of the really high resolution coverage we have in the plant. So I'm going to show a cross-section in depth, this to illustrate some of the things that you find in the subsurface here. So here we have a 6 kilometer per second, several 100-foot thick set of diabase. Maybe a thinner stringer of it up here, and these will have the largest response in terms of they have the biggest impedance contrast. They can dominate the seismic reflectivity, and they're not necessarily related to what we're trying to look for. We're trying to look for evidence of faulting, tectonic structure, deformation of stratigraphic units. So I'm going to go and show you a larger scale cross-section, 3 west-east cross-sections, just so you can see what some of the larger scale appearance of the diabase looks like in the subsurface. So we're going to go from south, just the south end of the plant, up north, 2,000 feet north, and 3,000 feet north. They tend to have, what's been found in others called a saucer shape to them. Now this one is like about 1.5 kilometers wide. That is, they're saucer shaped. They're flattish here. They may have some additional sills and intrusions here, and they tend to warp upward, welling upward of the magma. And so they occur like here, that's a kilometer and a half wide. This one has sort of like a little chamber and then another saucer shape. Then this is further, that's another. These are all not necessarily, we can't, they're irregular. Our imaging of them irregular. But what they represent is something that can dominate the acoustic structure that we image, because they can create, just due to the intrusion, the volume of intrusion, what you call force folds, and truly dominate the seismic, signature, and overprint. This is, if you're trying to look at the intrinsic sort of seismic stratigraphy of the sediments, this is a much larger signal. It produces folds, uplift, deformation. These are not like faulting. These are literally just due to differential amounts of volume intruded into different areas. And what we can see in and around the plant area is that in the tertiary, these have the potential to be quite disruptive of the fabric we're trying to map to understand tectonic faulting. But even on a deeper scale, these can potentially impact what we see in seismic imaging, and we'd like to be able to correlate what we see in the seismic images with particular geologic units. So I'm going to show, a line extracted through the 3D volume here that comes into this area where we observe the shallower diabases. And here, are two of those primary interpreted sort of south pismosyncline bounding faults, an outer one and inner fault that will be associated with enough throw to explain, almost 11,000 or potentially more feet of tertiary units observed in the tidewater well. Okay, so we need some way to go from what, is generally shallow basement to basement's got to be somewhere down here. There's got to be some structural way of doing that. So, if you look then at, the velocity overlay in this area, this sort of weird structure saying that you come down to a high velocity and the high velocity comes up, and it starts to get into the range that's high enough to be almost, unique in the area to something that's at least a mix of diabase with, we assume Franciscan on this side, but this, we don't know. This could be tertiary, it could be any number of things in the basin. And so this is another example on a larger scale of potential overprinting of acoustic structure with a potential intrusive. And then in the basin, we had, unusually high velocities in the lower part of the tertiary Monterey and the upper part of the Obispo that, may be related, if this is an intrusive, with, alteration and other effects. Not things that, without sonic logging and everything we expected to see when we went into this. But, when you look at these interpretations, one of the things, well, you can draw a line almost anywhere. Well, not necessarily. So I'm going to flip through, because you actually have breaks in continuity going all the way up. There's actually a bifurcation in the sort of branches through the section. So I'm going to turn it on, turn it off, and flip back and forth. There are, clear breaks, through the section. You can, we can all argue, we all have different personal preferences for how we wiggle these things, but, there are first order terminations of, characteristic structure we think, the Franciscan against structure in the interior. So, there are lines that are so crooked or, irregular that there's much less signal to noise. That's just something we, that comes from the acquisition constraints. There's limited 3D coverage. I basically showed you two of the three areas where we're able to extract some QT profiles that provide some useful first order sort of deeper constraints. The velocities, don't necessarily uniquely associate with any one particular unit, with the exception of the diabase. I think the most important thing is that we, even when we're successful at doing the highest quality imaging, we're imaging acoustic structure. And we've got abundant evidence now, around the plant house that some of the structure, acoustic structure, is not necessarily related to geologic processes we're trying to map. It may be related to intrusion and secondary effects from intrusions. And so those can cross-cut or follow bedding, and they produce force folds and thickness variations that can produce very dramatic acoustic structure that isn't related to primary faulting. Okay. So and I'll show you. I think we see general large-scale 3D velocity and density variations that correlate with large-scale structure. But there are some surprises we've encountered. Some of the most regular and spatially extensive reflectivity depth is in the Franciscan Formation. It is a formation that can have a wide variety of compositions and structures. We generally can't observe those short wavelength folds that you see at the surface. That's just not something that's resolvable, in this kind of acquisition of seismic reflection data. I'm going to briefly go through the tomographic data, and I'll spend a little time setting up, and then I'm just going to flip through it so you can sort of see the really large-scale first-order, association of velocity and density variation. So you can see, well, what do these, interpreted faults look like in relation to the large-scale tomographic images? And so the next one is going to be sort of the explanation of what you're looking at. So, it's a 3D perspective. Now, north is this way, so we're looking east-southeast from above the Irish Hills, okay? And I'm starting with a low velocity so that you only see where we had rays because the sources and receivers are close together. In other words, you're seeing pretty much our acquisition geometry to a large extent. We had more nodes out here. And in the fact here that we had actually such a low velocity surface that actually, even though we have irregular lines here, they were already refracting and creating some aerial coverage in here. So each one of these is going to be a color rendering of the elevation, the shallowest elevation that we encounter that isovelocity or isodensity. So in the highest part of the hills in the Franciscan, you'll encounter this velocity or velocity even higher than this right at the surface, right on topography, at 1,500–1,600 feet above sea level. And the flip side of that is in the deepest sort of trough on the north side of the Los Osos Fault, you'll actually have to go almost 1,000 feet below sea level even to see this velocity in the tertiary or Franciscan, and some of the Franciscan and north can get pretty slow. So I've rendered the Los Osos Fault as a 3D plane here. You can see it underneath the topography because it's generally mapped in the subsurface primarily, and I'm just connecting all the different interpreted intersections on various seismic lines and projecting them into the line. Similarly, this is the Edna B, the northernmost fault, which we have geologically jumps over from an area of intermixed Franciscan and tertiary units over to the Edna A, which to the southeast is sort of the boundary between the tertiary Franciscan units to the north. So these sort of both form, a pair, a step over pair, but also, one at the beginning of the inner pismosyncline graben faults. This is the, one of the primary ones on the inner graben faults on the north side, and then this is, the southernmost of the pismosyncline bounding faults. And I'm going to step through them a little slowly, and then I'll just flip through them a little faster so you can see, how the velocity structure, corresponds to some of the interpreted faults. So this is the unusual, we think, altered zone of lower Monterey, upper Obispo tertiary rocks. So this would be the area we call the inner graben. This would be the thickest part of the tertiary units in the deep tidewater well. The Los Osos Fault is under here. It's under the surface. You can see the higher velocity that this velocity, the highest rocks are on the hanging wall of the Los Osos Fault. Okay, and then we have that surface dropping way toward Los Osos, and the higher velocity and higher elevation, Franciscan rocks are basically bounded between our Edna A and the Los Osos Fault in here. And then to the south, we have this sort of high of the units sitting in the hanging wall of this fault, and it's going to be a persistent feature as you go down. The other thing you'll see is, the pillow basalts, the Avila pillow basalts, are on the southeast end of the survey. So they'll sit up high near there because they have a fairly high velocity. Similarly, the Cretaceous rocks are relatively high velocity. And then we have the irregular intrusive complex here. This is the larger scale version. I showed you some of the tomography at finer scales. This is the 200 by 200 by 200. So, this is what anticlines look like. They tend to, in an anticline, you tend to push up the higher velocities in the anticlinal fold, and sort of synclinal trough behind it. And if that was a reasonable interpretation of this, then these units should step inward along with the interpreted fault. So you'll see, as the fault goes down, those higher velocity materials move inward, and then you start to see some of the really deeper aspects of the basin. Those that to get to this velocity, you're now going almost 8,000 feet below sea level. You have bits and pieces of high velocity, like parts of Franciscan, which could be meta-graywacke or serpentinite or any number of things. I'm just going to step through and then step back. So if you're going to propose a model, what we see here is a deepening and a narrowing of the basin expressed in terms of isovelocities. Okay, so I'm going to step back up to the top and just step down again. Okay, so we weren't able to, the interpretation team, to always, these are large-scale velocity data, consider them in detail in any particular interpretation. So this is another sort of way of looking at, well, do the interpreted faults make some sense to first order? And you can do the same thing with the densities, which are even smoother. And what you'll see is, again, you have relatively high density stuff at shallow elevation in the Franciscan. These are actually serpentinite bodies out on the north side of Los Osos Valley that track back to east, southeast toward the Los Osos Fault. So we have the low densities here, and again we have relatively high density material associated shallow with where the Franciscan exposed, this area where dolomite called out the tidewater well, Franciscan, Cretaceous, and then irregular intrusives over here. I'll just step down again. You see the same sort of structure in the density field, in the hanging wall of this interpreted fault. So, by the time you're done, you have a fairly sort of deep trough to get to that density. So, the reflection and tomography data provides some useful data on a variety of scales in the subsurface, scales and depth ranges. They vary depending on the data type and location, because the signal to noise or the acquisition geometry vary across the hills. I showed you profiles that were better oriented, for the purpose of looking specifically at, the Los Osos Fault. We were able to extract some 2D profiles from the 3D volume, but we didn't have consistent 3D coverage throughout the hills. There are many areas, that have, freedom folds and other structures that, that create cross-cutting artifacts when you're just looking at 2D data. Okay, because those artifacts can become particularly strong on very crooked lines. We don't typically, we don't image with these 2011 data in the top 100, 500 feet. 500 feet is when you're trying to do very large scale 3D migrations. We just had to view off more of the top. So it's not possible to directly associate, surface geology continuously from the surface down to the seismic image. Most of the thickness of crust of what we're trying to image in is Jurassic Cretaceous Franciscan Complex rocks. They record a history from the Jurassic Cretaceous to the present. And the present for us is we're trying to understand Quaternary present. Except in, the center of the Pismo syncline where we have a thick section of Tertiary rocks. So, maybe I'll take questions.
Well, thank you, Dan. I'm just going to offer commentary and something to put out for discussion among the IPRP as we craft a response to this. And I should say for members who weren't here, really appreciate a whole day that we spent with Dan and others that we're going to hear from in the afternoon further about the interpretation of this. But after looking at this data all day and after looking at a large number of other sections that are in the report that we just didn't have time to present here, I have to be honest and say that I don't agree completely with the conclusions listed there, and in fact on some of them I don't agree at all. The basic conclusion that I've come to is that I can't accept the identification of faults on the seismic data that you've seen as anything close to unique. The ones that are shown there and many others that are actually shown in the report could be drawn anywhere, and ones that are drawn in some cases are not consistent with the standards of interpretation that are listed in the report in terms of, in some cases you see faults being drawn right through the middle of continuous reflectors that just don't make sense to me. And if you go back and spend a lot of time looking at these sections, these seismic reflection data, I believe you can draw faults in a whole bunch of other places that are as consistent with those interpretations. We discussed that at some length 10 or 11 days ago. I think the basic issue here is a significant issue with the acquisition and the processing of this data as to whether these data can support any particular interpretation that's relevant here. These data are being collected, and you can see a peek of it right in the upper right-hand corner of this slide. That's the topography that's being surveyed here. The axis was crooked, the topography was huge, and the near-surface variability of materials was huge. All of these make it exceedingly difficult and the best case scenario to get anything resembling a seismic image out of these kinds of data. I am not convinced that the 2D lines that they're showing here, which are extracted out of a semi-3D processing of data that don't line up in a nice clean slice, I can't be at all sure that what we're seeing there is not energy that's been reflected from far offline. Again, you look at the complexity. We know that we have a lot of Franciscan formation here. We know we have a huge amount of deformation. When you do this crooked line and try to treat it as a 3D volume and draw a straight line through it, you do not have the aperture in the cross-line direction to actually be sure that you haven't eliminated energy that's come from offline. So that's a ground level issue. The other thing is looking at those seismic sections, I see them as heavily processed. There's very honest assessment of these data sets in the report, and Dan is very forthright in explaining the pros and cons, the limitations, where the data can actually be collected in a high quality way and where they can't. But in the tomography, there's an extensive discussion of the difficulties of gathering data around that power plant that you see in the slide. There's just places you can't go. There's places you can't insert seismic energy, and there's places you can't put receivers, not to mention the noise that's coming off this building. So he showed some tomographic slices that were showing diabase intrusions, and we'll talk more about these in the afternoon, I expect, because those features may be setting up to be significant in the interpretation of both the Diablo Cove fault issue that Dr. Hamilton brings forward. They may, at our next meeting, come up in the question of site response. But again, as we looked through the data in the working meeting, where large velocities are identified in some instances, there are not corresponding strong reflections that you would expect. There's some basic physics going on, and I only bring that up as a note to suggest that if the results of those studies are to be considered in the overall interpretation and are part of an interpretation that's significant regarding the hazard, I think there needs to be a lot more review of the actual acquisition and data processing of those data, because there are some things that just don't add up. And so we did manage, again, appreciate it was a full day of going around on these things, and we learned a lot, I think. But in terms of the role of the IPRP, I mentioned to colleagues that I at this point, I wanted that on the table as a frame of where we go in terms of our commentary on Chapter 7. So I'll let others speak to their impressions as well.
And I think most of my questions are going to end up being for the geologic interpretation of this data, because if these images of acoustic structure don't represent geologic structure, I have no handle on them at all. But in order for me to get a handle on what these represent, I'd like to start with all of these really extensive sets of reflectors within the Franciscan, which extend for kilometers across some of these sections. And if I thought I knew anything about the Franciscan, it was that it was on a very small wavelength, very irregular. And to see continuous reflectors that go on at the same distance for kilometers is not what I thought I knew, not what I expected. So maybe that's something we can address now. Maybe we can address that this afternoon. What are these?
Yeah, I think just briefly, it's like north of here, exposed to the surface, you have the west ophiolite. Okay. So what is an ophiolite? It's an alternating sequence. So, one, possible explanation is that buried beneath the melange, in the Franciscan package is, some preserved regular ophiolite. That's, we don't know. But, we've seen, in other areas, Franciscan being, potentially very reflective. Sometimes it was like higher grade metamorphic parts come up and are exhumed basically, and it becomes, you see very strong reflectivity in the Franciscan. But honestly, we don't know. It wasn't what we expected to see, but it was one of the most persistent. It didn't matter who processed the data. It was CGG, or the guys who finally did the last iteration. It's like we see, it was very persistent structure in a part of the northern Irish Hills.
This is probably a good time to take lunch break.
Are we a little behind? Okay.
I have to leave, so if I could just make a very brief suggestion. I'm sorry I won't be with you for the afternoon, but I have a suggestion for the panel about your next session. I've been working with a small informal team of geologists, geophysicists, and nuclear engineers reviewing the PG&E study, and we were struck, as I suppose the peer review panel was, by Chapter 13, and particularly struck by what are really extraordinary ramifications of the tables in Chapter 13. And I want to make available for you, if it would help you at your next session, we could make a presentation that might help clarify some of those issues. So I know you have to break for lunch. I'll leave my contact information in case you're interested.
So it's a 12:15. 12, if we break for about an hour, come back 1:15.
We have a panel and a presentation, so we can go.
Okay, what I'd like to do is summarize the results of the 2011 Onshore Seismic Interpretation Program efforts, or ONSIP. And ONSIP was performed under the auspices of AB 1632. The objective was to interpret 2D and 3D seismic reflection data that were acquired in the Irish Hills and Los Osos Valley in 2011. Specifically, to evaluate the subsurface geometry of faults and other geologic structures. Several of the key ones that we were focusing on, or we would be focusing on going into the study, were the Los Osos Fault Zone, the Edna Fault Zone, San Miguelito Fault Zone, and San Luis Fault Zone. And what our intent was to combine the interpretation of the seismic images with additional information from map surface geology, geophysics, data from petroleum exploration wells, to assess the sequence and timing of major deformation events in the Irish Hills as they're recorded in the geology. Okay, this is a map that we've looked at previously, just showing the Irish Hills and the extent of the seismic acquisition. The red lines are 2D lines were acquired in 2011. This box outlines the zone of a regular 3D coverage that was acquired in 2011. And these areas down the southern end of the Irish Hills were part of a 2012 3D acquisition effort that was not subject of the onset. Okay, so the interpretation approach. The interpretation was performed by a team of 4 geologists. Josh Goodman and Jamie Turner of Fugro, Robert Gibbler and myself of Lettuce Consultants. And initially, we began working more or less independently, and we looked at the data independently to develop our own interpretations. During the course of the study, we received additional technical input from Michael Angel, from Fugro, a structural geologist, and Dan O'Connell was part of our team that advised us on geophysics. During the course of the effort, when we came to major interpretation milestones, the team got together, we held workshops, and we presented our interpretations to each other. We looked at them critically to identify areas of consensus, but we also looked at where the interpretations were different, and we discussed them in some detail and really attempted to assess whether or not they are viable alternative interpretations, that they satisfy the other data that are available to us, and that they could reproduce the geologic features that we saw at the surface in a geometrically reasonable way. Okay, just a comment on the onset data quality. As Dan discussed in his presentation, Irish Hills posed some extremely challenging conditions for seismic data acquisition and processing. The process site onset data are not unambiguous snapshots or pictures or 2D cross-sections of the subsurface geologic structure. What we agree about as a team, however, is that the seismic data do image key subsurface relationships locally, such as the top of bedrock, places where the top of the bedrock has been offset by fault. So when we can combine these local observations of these relationships with other data, again, geologic map data, potential field data, exploration well data, we have worked to incorporate these in an integrated, internally consistent model of the subsurface structure. Okay, so here's a map of the geologic map of the Irish Hills, and just to point out the locations of the major known faults that were a focus of the study. From south to north, there's the Los Osos Fault, which bounds the northern margin of the Irish Hills. In the interior of the Irish Hills, in the more central part of the Irish Hills, is the Edna Fault Zone. And there are 2 main splays of the Edna Fault Zone that are observed and mapped at the surface that we informally refer to as Edna A and Edna B. And we'll be talking more about those during the course of the presentation. And then in the southern part of the Irish Hills, there's the San Miguelito Fault Zone here. And then cutting across the very southeastern tip of the Irish Hills is the map trace of the San Luis Bay Fault Zone. And just to cut straight to the chase and provide you with the key interpretations of the fault geometry for these 4 main structures. Our interpretation is that within the depth range imaged by the reflection data, the Los Osos Edna Fault Zone, San Miguelito Fault Zone, San Luis Bay Fault Zone are moderately to steeply dipping structures. The Los Osos Fault, Edna Fault Zone both dip to the southwest. The San Miguelito Fault Zone in the depth range that we were imaging it is subvertical to steeply south dipping. And the San Luis Bay Fault Zone, we've interpreted to be a steeply north dip of the fault. Okay, what I'd like to do now is focus initially on the Los Osos Fault, and I'll walk you through, show you some of the seismic lines that we use to interpret the down dip geometry of it. There are three main seismic lines we looked at, lines 138, 149 here. This is line 150 here. I believe Dan showed us examples of both of these lines, or at least line 150. And then line 204 north over here. Okay, so the red colors indicate that these are both AWD lines, so shallower high resolution imaging. And then 204 is a fiber-sized source line with deeper. So let's start by looking at line 138, 149. It's an east-west line that obliquely crosses the northern front of the Irish Hills. And it's also important, I think, to point out that this line acquired almost exclusively in the Franciscan complex, and the Franciscan complex certainly underlies the entire line of depth. Okay, here's line 148, 149. Now, as you can see, this is this is all Franciscan complex down here, and there is a lot of reflectivity. Chris, as you mentioned in your comment after Dan's talk, that you didn't expect knowing that the Franciscans typically regarded as a chaotic unit, you wouldn't expect to see coherent layered reflectivity in it. That was probably our interpretation going in as well, but this is indeed coherent layered reflectivity. Where we have these lines, two lines that cross each other, we can correlate, and they're at different angles, we can correlate reflectors at different lines. So these are coherent reflectors that are imaged by crossing lines. And it's possible that this layered reflectivity developed, it's a large-scale foliation rock that developed during subduction and accretion of the Franciscan complex to the accretion of it. Certainly there is a large-scale structural foliation in the Franciscan. You can see it, we have the Beaton's contrast. Okay, so now as interpreters, this is not layered stratigraphy in the classic sense, so what we were looking for were first-order changes in the geometry of the reflectors or discontinuities that would indicate the possible locations of faults, possibly. So, looking at this seismic line, as we discussed it, what we noted is that there's a sub-horizontal pattern to the reflectors here on the eastern edge of the line. And then as you cross a hinge point right about there, the reflector geometry changes. It's dipping to the east. And also the reflectors are discontinuous, broken, and there's a loss of coherency. Likewise, there's a loss of coherency in the reflectors as you move from east to west here, and you can trace this loss of coherency up through broken and discontinuous reflectors in the shallow part of the section. Okay, this is our interpretation of the seismic line. We interpret this collection of offset and discontinuous reflectors up through here to be a fault that projects up to the surface trace of the Los Osos Fault where it's mapped by Lettison Hall. And we interpret this to be a fault as well that, again, interrupts the continuity, coherence of the reflectors that projects up to the surface near the contact between serpentinite and metavolcanics. And that contact is mapped at the surface where we're in. Okay, so let's take a look now at line 150. And again, line 150 crosses the front of the Irish Hills. It also ends up in Franciscan at its northeast end, and it's in Franciscan at its southwest end, and it crosses some shallow Lydian and Los Osos Fault. Okay, now this line, I would argue the reflectivity, the layered reflectivity is more coherent and more continuous. It could well be because this line is at a higher angle to the structural foliation in the Franciscan complex. But looking at this line, what we see, what the interpretation saw was this broad, synformal folding of the reflectors that you can trace relatively continuously up to here, and then here the synformal folding is this pattern is of the reflectors are discontinuous, they're truncated, and they're juxtaposed locally against reflectors with very discordant depths. So, and there's a pattern of discontinuity that we can trace up to there. Similarly, we identified another area where there was truncated reflectors. Reflectors are broken up in the southwestern part of the section. Okay, so this is our interpretation of the seismic line. This very prominent disturbance in the reflector geometry is we've interpreted as being a steeply dipping fault. Again, that projects up to the surface trace of the Lettison Hall mapping of the Los Osos Fault. And these broken reflectors may be associated with, they project up just to the north of the bedrock trace of the Los Osos Fault Fault.
So, ask not to interrupt your talk. Can I ask you a question at this point? Did your team go looking for alternate interpretations and then debate which ones were the best expressed faults in these sections, or did you came up with a bunch of different? And the parameter we talked about is a significant one for Los Osos, was the dip of the Los Osos. So if it's steeply dipping, it doesn't get anywhere near the plan, it's not a factor. Right? So did you go looking for the shallowest plane you could make as consistent with this data?
We did consider some shallow interpretations, but I think our preferred interpretation is something that looks like this.
And as part of the debate of these things, you looked at, I can draw much shallower truncations through here, and looking at this plane and other ones, you ruled those out. It's not preferred.
Not preferred, yes. Not ruled them out, but not preferred.
So these are...
Well, in some cases, perhaps ruled them out. We just felt that they were not as... you'd have to draw a more tortured path to get through to get through the broken reflectors. So.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm just on this plane. I'm just looking at it. Can you draw a 30-degree dipping plane from the Lettison Hall trace down to the left? Yeah, it's tough.
It's tougher,
but it's not. But
again, this would be our preferred interpretation.
That's part of the analysis you went through. Just want to make sure that you cover that. So I think Bruce expressed this earlier. You can draw a lot of things into these. And because it's the significant factor is the shallowest dip is the highest hazard. And I start looking at what is the shallowest plane you can draw there. It might not be quite as good as what you got, but I think you can find zones like that.
I agree. You can find zones like that, but again, I think this is a better and more defensible geologic interpretation.
Yeah. Okay. I'd say the other thing is some planes you find, and then you go to the next line. It's like, how do I connect these two things?
Correct. And that's the key thing we're not going to see in the presentation is whether you can see it on multiple lines, and that's what I'm checking at this point.
And if I could, you're not going to see it on multiple lines. You don't have well control, and you don't have surface correlation in all places. So,
that's the interpretation.
If each of those steps widens the universe, and again, my point being, where else we can draw lines according to the same set of standards that you imposed on yourself in drawing these lines.
Okay, good enough. All right, well, let's take a look now at line 204, which is a vibroseis line. It's located to the west of or kind of more in the central western Irish Hills. And at this point, this part of the Irish Hills, the Los Osos Fault is drawn as a dotted queried feature because the people who have mapped it have not identified a discrete surface trace of the fault here. indicating that it's either buried by some younger deposits or perhaps it hasn't even broken up to the surface. Okay, so let's take a look at line 204 north. Okay, again, this is a fiber-sized line, so the depth of imaging is greater. And again, we're also looking at a deeper view of all Franciscan. This is all Franciscan rocks. And it's still, even at using a fiber-sized source and looking deeper, we still see well-developed layered reflectivity throughout the entire section. Okay, so as interpreters and looking at this line, what we did was we saw this patch of bright, high-amplitude reflectors, which was consistently observed and also imaged on the 3D data. We could trace them from north to south, and as we enter this area right through here, the reflectors become discontinuous and very discordant. Likewise, this patch of layered high-amplitude reflectors down here is terminated right down through here. If you come at it from the south, this high-amplitude set of reflectors is dipping in the opposite direction. It enters into the zone, and it's truncated or disturbed. And then just looking up dip, there's a zone of different reflector geometry and amplitude up dip, separating the reflectors over here that generally dip to the north, and these reflectors, which again are set horizontal. So our interpretation of this line is that there is a steeply dipping fault or faults, steeply south dipping fault or faults that are responsible for the offset and truncation of these reflectors and this disturbed zone right through here. Tracing this up dip through this patch of reflectors here, what we don't see is good evidence that these reflectors are consistently offset all the way up through the shallow part of the section. However, these layered reflectors in the shallow part of the section are folded into a monocline, or perhaps you don't like this limb of the monocline up here, this part of it, then it's a homoclinal dip to the north that flattens across a synclinal hinge to the north beneath the Los Osos Fault. And so we think that it's, in this interpretation, the Los Osos Fault dies out, tip of the fault dies out at depth, and slip on the fault, reverse slip on the fault, is accommodated by uplift, tilting, and folding of the hang wall as a fault propagation fault. So to summarize, a fault or fault zone is imaged along or beneath the northern Irish Hills range front, the northern, I would say northeastern and northwest central Irish Hills where we have the reflection. And the range front fault dips steeply south in shallow AWD lines, appears to maintain a moderate to steep dip to a minimum depth of about 12,000 feet in fiber-sized line 204. Based primarily on line 204 at the latitude of the central and western longitude of the central and western Irish Hills, the range front fault may be blind and not extend to the surface. And it may produce uplift, tilting, and folding of the range front. Okay, so that's the Los Osos Fault. Now let's move south and look at the faults that are associated with the deformed Pismo Basin in the interior of the Irish Hills. The purple rocks up here are the Franciscan complex, that's Mesozoic basement. There's also Mesozoic Franciscan rocks and some Cretaceous Great Valley sandstones down here in the southeastern corner of the Irish Hills. Between them are primarily Miocene age marine sediments that were deposited in the ancestral Pismo Basin, which has been uplifted, tilted, and folded to form the Pismo syncline, the axis of which is right through here, since late Miocene or since Pliocene time. The northern structural boundary of the Pismo Basin, where these sediments are faulted against the bedrock, is the Edna Fault Zone. And the southern structural boundary, at least right here, is the San Miguelito Fault, where you have the lower part of this tertiary basin section faulted against Franciscan bedrock. So what I'd like to do is take a look first at the northern limb of the Pismo syncline, then look at the southern limb of the Pismo syncline, look at the structure underneath it, and what we can infer from the reflection data, from surface geology, and from borehole data, and from potential field data, and then combine them to show what our interpretation of the first order structure of the Pismo basin is beneath the axis of the Pismo syncline. Okay, so let's start with line 204 up here in the northwestern corner of the Irish Hills. The northeastern end of line 204 starts on Franciscan bedrock, crosses the Edna B trace of the Edna fault zone, and then obliquely crosses the northern limb of the Pismo syncline. And there are two versions of this line. There's an AWD version and a Vibra-size version, and the comparison and contrast of the two different lines actually, we felt, helped lend some confidence in the interpretation of the structure in the seismic line. So first, let's take a look at line 204. I just want to point out, line 204 is the Vibra AWD version. And this is a good example of the crooked geometry that Dan was talking about that complicates things. There are places where this line it's at least oblique to the strike of the bedding, but there are other large parts of it that are parallel to the strike of bedding, so that complicates the imaging and the interpretation. Oh, I guess, but first I'm going to mention the stratigraphy in the Irish Hills. The tertiary section that sits on top of the bedrock that we're interested in kind of tracking in the subsurface is comprised of the Obispo Formation, Monterey Formation, and Pismo Formation. And these three colors, the blue, the green, and the beige and the pink, is the way they're shown in the map. And we're going to keep the color coding consistent as a convention when looking at the reflection data. So specifically, we're going to try to carry the map the top of the Obispo Formation, the top of the Monterey Formation into the subsurface, and where they're crossed by the seismic lines, again, to help to guide the interpretation of that. So now let's talk about line 204, and we'll look at the AWD version first. And just, again, this is the Obispo Formation, the blue unit down here. This is the top of the Obispo Formation, the base of the Monterey. And then here's the top of the Monterey Formation, the base of the Pismo. And these are the units we're going to carry into the subsurface. Okay, line 204. This is the eastern edge of the line is here, the western edge of the line is here. This line crosses the surface trace of the Edna B fault, right about into here. And you'll notice that the reflective fabric here at the east end of the line is very similar to the reflective fabric we saw in the Franciscan and the previous lines. Coarsely spaced, high amplitude reflectors, subparallel or at least layered. Over here on the south side of the Edna B fault, you see these, what we think are Franciscan type reflectors of depth. And above the Franciscan reflectors are more closely spaced, lower amplitude layer reflectors that project up to surface exposures of the lower part of the Miocene section. Okay? So that contact between the two, that change in reflector character is somewhere through here. And we think that change in reflector character jumps down to about here because we have layered stratigraphy up into here. Again, that projects up to the surface exposures of the Miocene section. And you can see there are also discontinuities within these layered reflectors in the shallow part of the section. Okay, this is our interpretation of the line. We think that our interpretation is that the Edna B fault is a steeply dipping fault, and the trace of it that we've drawn truncates a number of, laterally truncates a number of these reflectors and what we think are Franciscan at depth. We think this is the top of the basement. We interpret this to be the top of the basement, and that it steps down to the south primarily across a series of south dipping normal faults beneath the northern limb of the Pismo syncline. And this curving geometry of the fault that you see here is in part a function of the crooked geometry of the seismic line. That's what it looks like if you render it correctly in a curving seismic line. And we know that the basement has to be deeper than the bottom of this well, because this well, the HO1 well, bottomed in either the pismal formation or okay, so let's take a look now at the Vibra-sized version of this line. Okay, the Vibe line image is deeper. This is where the surface trace of the Edna B fault is, right over into here. And we think that the difference in that the same stratigraphy, the same features are captured, but there's differences in the reflected character that are better captured in some ways by the Vibe line. For example, this looks to us like the top of the basement, and the layered reflectors here above that project up the surface exposures of the lower part of the tertiary section. And you have this transparent zone underneath with these Franciscan-like reflectors below. And you can trace this contact over like this, and so it steps down. Here's that contact here, slightly transparent zone. Reflectors here that are dipping in the direction of the stratigraphy of the surface, and these very discordant dips that we think are related or associated with Franciscan depth. So this is our interpretation of the line. And here's the Edna B fault. We carry it down through these discontinuous or truncated reflectors to depth. This is the top of basement here that we've interpreted. Again, steps down across a series of south-dipping faults beneath the northern limb of the Bismuth syncline. Okay, now, let me just back up and say, oops, back up and point out that we identified this fault that offsets, that we've interpreted to offset the basement on both the AWD and the Vibra sites. We interpret that this is the continuation of the Edna A fault. And what we're doing is we're just showing that this down to the south normal fault, if you extend the surface trace of the Edna A fault at depth and project it to this line, this is where it would intersect the line. And we think that this is these seismic lines image the buried westward continuation of the Edna A fault. Now, just to show you how we have carried this interpretation around the corner and tied it to the northern end of 103, 104, the next line I'm going to show you is going to be the AWD version of 204 joined at this point with the northern end of 103, 204. I'm just going to fold them out so that the left side of the figure is going to be this line and the right side of the figure is this line. Okay, so this is the interpretation of that we just talked about of 204. The imaging in the AWD version of 103, 104 is not quite as crisp. However, we have some well data, two wells that were drilled to basement at the northern end of this line, and the depth of basement coincides with this reflector here that we think is the top of the basement. Okay, so by carrying tracking this reflector southward, looks like it starts to dip to the south and is terminated here along what we think is the continuation of the Edna A fault. So again, you can look at this as mirror images of the structure captured by these two different lines. But we think that we can trace the Edna A fault from its surface exposure to 204 and into 103, 104. And then there's another fault, we think, that to the south of the Edna A in the subsurface, the Edna C, and I'll talk about that in just a moment. Okay, the imaging is not as clear and crisp in the southern end of 103, 104. So to look at the southern limb of the Pismo syncline, I'm going to look at this piece of line 141, 142, this arbitrary line that Dan extracted from the 3D volume. And Dan showed you this line previously, but we'll take a look at it in some detail here. At its southern end, it starts in the Obispo Formation. It crosses the contact between the Obispo and the Monterey Formation, continues across the contact, the upper contact of the Monterey, and just crosses the axis of the Pismo syncline. Okay, here's the seismic line. Southern end is here, the northern end is here. And what caught our eye as interpreters is this package of layered north-dipping reflectors here in the shallow subsurface that project up to the surface exposures of the Obispo and the Monterey Formation. But if you'll notice, there's this call it a reflector here, below which the reflective fabric is very discordant. It's dipping in the opposite direction. So we think that these are reflectors in the bedrock. Could be Franciscan, could be Cretaceous, but it could well be Franciscan, but we think they're bedrock. And we think this is the top of the bedrock, and this is the base of the neogene section on top of it. So this is the top of the bedrock. It's dipping to the north, pretty much parallel to the dip of the stratigraphic section at the surface. But we think it's truncated here, and it steps down in a stair-stepping or staircase-like manner down to the north beneath the axis of the pismal syncline. So over here in the interpretation that you can see, here's the top of the basement, and it steps down here, down to here, down to here, into the axis of the pismal syncline, and above, and as a consequence of stepping down across these normal faults, the thickness of the tertiary section increases radically. It gets doubles or triples in thickness relative to what you can see at the surface. Okay, so let's take a look at the companion to this line, the 141-142 north, which starts at its northern end up in the Franciscan, in the bedrock, crosses the B trace of the Edna Fault, crosses the A trace of the Edna Fault, ends up at about in the axis of the pismo syncline, just to the west of the Tidewater well, which was drilled to a depth of greater than 10,000 feet, almost 11,000 feet, and never encountered basement. Okay, so at the northern end and the southern end of the line, and as interpreters, what caught our eye were these packages of reflectors that they may not be classic marker horizons, but nonetheless they are packages of coherent reflectors that have a common geometry and they certainly have a common orientation. And you can trace them along here, you can trace them along here, you can trace them along here, and they're terminated right in through here. This is the trace of the Edna A fault right in through here. Over here looking at the interpreted section, this is our interpretation of the down dip geometry of the Edna B fault. It's associated with some minor disruption of the reflectors right in through here. There's very little throw on the Edna B fault along this fault, where the seismic line was acquired. The throw on the fault increases as you go to the north, and that could be explained by a on-echelon transfer of normal slip along these faults during the time that that they were active in the Miocene during the subsidence of the ancestral pismal basin. Anyway, so this is where the Edna B fault is. This is the Edna A fault at the surface. And this is the major truncation of the reflectors here. We also see another discontinuity of the reflectors down and through here. And here's an example of where we think there's good evidence for, at least we like the interpretation of the fault here, but when you get to this point, you hit a reflector and it looks like you have to run your fault through this reflector down through here.
And there's also two examples higher up in the section, right above the lettering, right down, just down, right above that, right there, and about halfway to the surface as well.
Come right through it, right?
Okay, and we also have all these discontinuities right in through here. I take your point. But let me show you now. Let me put these two halves of the line together. We're going to just match them. We're going to move this. We're going to just move them together along the axis of the pismal syncline, and we're going to project information from the Tidewater well onto the seismic line. We're also going to project information from the Townsend Gunner well onto this combined seismic line. Now, the significance of this is that the Townsend Gunner was drilled just south of and in the hanging wall of the Edna A fault. It's drilled down about 2,000 feet and we encountered basement. Here, again, the Tidewater well was drilled to nearly 11,000 feet and never encountered basement. So somehow, the basement gets a lot deeper between these two wells. So this is by putting these together and putting the well data on, this is kind of a combined view of what the geometry of the ancestral Pismo Basin looks like underneath the axis of the Pismo syncline. So here's the Edna A fault. Bedrock is located at the surface just to the north of Edna A. Townsend Gunner suggests that the bedrock is dropped down about 2,000 feet in the hanging wall of Edna A. But then this is our Edna C fault, that across which the entire section of the tertiary section thickens radically. And starting from the south, here's the top of the basement, and it's our interpretation that it steps down across these series of these north-dipping normal faults beneath the southern line of the Pismo syncline. Here, 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 and probably below, well, definitely below the bottom of the tidewater. So the overall geometry of the basin is this roughly triangular shape here, with the Edna C fault, at least at this point in the Irish Hills, accommodating the greatest amount of slip and accommodating the what we think is stratigraphic thickening primarily of the Obispo Formation and the Tidewater Well. These structures, these anethetic faults, accommodating secondary or amount of the subsidence of the basin. Okay, let's take a look at line 112, 140 quickly, which starts here near Point San Luis, moving northward, crossing across San Luis. So it crosses the San Luis, the map trace, the San Luis Bay Fault Zone, the San Miguelito Fault Zone, and it ends up here near the axis of the Pismo syncline near the Tidewater Well. Okay, this is an AWD line, and the imaging is challenging to interpret. But starting down here at the southern end of the seismic line, what we can see are these this layered reflectivity within the Franciscan, folded into this broad synform that we can trace these synformally folded reflectors to the north, but then they're truncated right about into here, right in the vicinity of the map trace of the San Luis Bay Fault. Okay, the reflectors up here are pretty diced up, but this is the general vicinity of the San Miguelito Fault. Right in through here, you can see that there are north-dipping reflectors that we think are part of the tertiary section, and that we have these discordant reflector dips underneath it again. So very similar to what we were looking at in 141, 142. We think that this is marking the top of basement, and then the imaging is core here in the core of the axis of the Pismo syncline. We think that the basement steps down across a series of normal faults, similar to what we were looking at in the previous line 141, 142. So this is the interpretation of line 112, 140. The truncation of these reflectors along the, we interpret that these reflectors are truncated along a steeply north-dipping fault that projects up to the surface trace of the San Luis Bay Fault Zone. Our preferred interpretation of the San Miguelito Fault Zone is of a series of subvertical to steeply south-dipping reflectors to separate these very these sliced and diced reflectors at shallow depth in the vicinity of the surface fault trace. Okay, here's the what we feel is the top of the basement. Again, layered reflectors above that are dipping in the same direction, same magnitude as the surface base dips, but very discordant reflector fabric below it. We can trace this reflector to the north. Appears to be offset or truncated along a fault that we've interpreted here and tied to other reflective terminations at Shep. Steps down to the north. And then we think the basement probably steps even farther down. Here's the Tidewater Well. The Tidewater Well actually extends deeper than the maximum depth of imaging on the seismic line. Probably the bottom of the Tidewater Well would probably be right about down here. And if you just project the basement, top of basement, parallel to bedding dip, and it was not offset by any faults, you would expect perhaps to encounter it in the tidewater well. That's not the case. Instead, there's a very thick section of Obispo Formation, and we think that that is best explained by growth of this basin during Obispo time and offset of the basement down to the north. Okay, so let me, what I'd like to do is show you a cross-section. This is a drawn cross-section. This is an interpretation that incorporates the interpretation of the reflection data with the surface geology and other information to show you kind of a holistic view of what the structure looks like from about here to here across the Pismo Syncline. Okay, so here, this is the southern end of the cross-section. There's the shoreline fault, subvertical fault that's been well defined by the seismicity data. Okay, here's the Pismo Syncline. And again, there's the Edna fault system that drops the basement down from the surface exposures in the northern Irish Hills across the Edna A fault, about 2,000 feet, and then another 8,000 feet, perhaps, across the Edna C fault, accounting for the thickening of the tertiary section in the Honolulu Tidewater Road. Then the basement steps back up to the south across a series of blind north-dipping normal faults beneath the southern limb of the Pismo Syncline. We think the San Miguelito fault zone could well be one of these faults, and that it's subvertical to south dipping now because it's on the tilted southern limb of the Pismo Syncline. So if you rotate the Pismo Syncline and the fault rotates with it, it would dip more toward the north, similar to these structures. And the San Miguelito fault zone drops or juxtaposes the basal tertiary deposits, the Obispo Formation, down to the north against the bedrock to the south. And then finally, this is the San Luis Bay fault zone, steeply north-dipping fault. The map relationships at the surface that give some sense of the sense of offset is the Franciscan complex here is faulted up on the north against the Cretaceous sandstone. The Franciscan is a structurally lower unit, and so this is structurally up, and if the fault dips to the north, then that's a reverse separation. Okay, also shown on this figure are the locations of small earthquakes that have been relocated precisely by Gene Hardebeck. The dots represent the different magnitudes of these small earthquakes. And what we've done is we've captured these earthquakes in about a 2 kilometer wide buffer on either side of the cross section, and just projected them on the cross section so that you can see where the shallow seismicity in the Irish Hills plots relative to these structures, these interpreted faults. Okay, let me just back up and say there's an independent line of evidence from the gravity data for the presence of this Edna C fault. And this is a gravity map of the Irish Hills and surrounding areas. The cool colors are high gravity values. The warmer colors, extending into the greens, are lower gravity values. This is the surface trace of the Edna A